Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into something a little darker than usual, but absolutely fascinating. Medieval justice. And I'm not talking about knights in shining armor or romantic tales of chivalry. I'm talking about a world where you could literally lose your head for things that would barely get you a parking ticket today. So before we begin this journey through some of the most bizarre and deadly laws in human history, take a moment to like the video if you're enjoying what we're exploring together, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always incredible to see this community span across the globe. Now settle in, maybe dim those lights, and let's step back in time to an era where justice was swift, brutal, and often completely insane by today's standards. Because what we're about to discover will make you grateful you weren't born a few centuries earlier. Picture this. It's a crisp morning in 1348, somewhere in the English countryside. The sun filters through the canopy of an ancient oak forest, and all seems peaceful. But for Thomas the woodcutter, this morning would be his last. His crime? He killed a swan. Not just any swan, mind you, but one of the king's swans. And in medieval England, that wasn't just poaching, that was treason, and treason meant death. You see, in the twisted logic of medieval law, swans belonged exclusively to the crown, every single one. They were considered royal birds, marked with specific notches on their beaks to identify their ownership. Thomas thought he was just catching dinner for his starving family during one of the worst famines in European history. But the law didn't care about his hungry children or his desperate circumstances. The law only cared that he had dared to touch property that belonged to the king. By noon, that same day, Thomas was hanging from a makeshift gallows in the village square, his lifeless body swaying in the wind as a warning to anyone else who might consider such audacious theft. His wife and children watched from the crowd, knowing they too might starve without his meager income. But justice, medieval style, had been served. This wasn't unusual. This was Tuesday in medieval Europe. The world we're about to explore operated on principles so foreign to our modern sensibilities that they seem almost fictional. But they weren't fiction. They were the harsh reality of daily life for millions of people across Europe and beyond during the Middle Ages. A time when the value of human life was often considered less than the value of property, where religious orthodoxy was enforced through terror, and where the social hierarchy was maintained through the constant threat of gruesome death. What made medieval law so particularly cruel wasn't just the severity of the punishments, though those were indeed horrific. It was the sheer randomness of what could get you killed. Steal a loaf of bread worth more than 12 pence. Death. Speak ill of the king in your local tavern. Death. Refuse to confess to a crime you didn't commit. Death. Work in your garden on a Sunday, in some places death. Be accused of witchcraft by a neighbor who coveted your land. Almost certainly, death. The medieval legal system wasn't designed around the concept of rehabilitation or even justice as we understand it today. It was designed around three core principles: retribution, deterrence, and the maintenance of social order. And nothing maintains social order quite like the spectacle of public execution. But here's what makes this even more fascinating and terrifying. These weren't laws created by madmen or sadists, though some of the rulers certainly qualified. These were laws that made perfect sense within the worldview of medieval society. They reflected deeply held beliefs about divine authority, social hierarchy, property rights, and moral order that were as fundamental to medieval people as our concepts of human rights and due process are to us today. Take the Forest Laws, for instance. When William the Conqueror invaded England in 1066, one of his first acts was to establish vast royal hunting preserves across the country. By the late 12th century, nearly 1/3 of all land in southern England was designated as royal forest. These weren't just hunting grounds for the king's pleasure. They were symbols of absolute power. sacred spaces where only the divinely appointed monarch had the right to take life. The penalties for violating forest laws were deliberately severe. Under William's son, William Rufus, poaching the king's deer could result in blinding, castration, or death. Even minor infractions like collecting fallen branches for firewood or clearing a small patch of land to grow food could result in massive fines that would bankrupt entire families. And if you couldn't pay the fine, well, there were other ways to settle the debt, but the cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated. Every brutal punishment served a purpose in the medieval mind. When a poacher was blinded and castrated in front of the entire village, it wasn't just punishment for that individual. It was a message to every other peasant who might be tempted to take what belonged to the king. The message was clear. This is what happens when you forget your place in the divine order of things. The church, meanwhile, had its own arsenal of deadly laws. Medieval Christianity wasn't the gentle, forgiving faith that many modern believers embrace. It was a militant institution that saw itself as locked in an eternal battle against the forces of evil, and it was willing to use any means necessary to win that battle. Heresy, the act of challenging religious doctrine, was considered worse than murder. After all, murder only killed the body. Heresy killed the soul. And not just the heretic's soul, but potentially the souls of everyone who heard the heretical ideas. This wasn't superstition to medieval people. This was cosmic warfare with eternal consequences. The penalties reflected this worldview. Heretics were burned alive, often after being tortured to extract confessions and the names of accomplices. The burning wasn't just execution, it was purification, a way of cleansing the world of spiritual contamination. The screams of the dying heretic were considered less important than the salvation of the community's collective soul. Witchcraft fell into the same category. The medieval world was alive with supernatural forces, and witches were seen as humans who had allied themselves with the devil to gain power over these forces. They could cause crop failures, spread disease, steal men's virility, or corrupt innocent children. In a world where a bad harvest meant starvation, and where disease could wipe out entire communities, the threat of witchcraft was very real to medieval minds. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, provided detailed instructions for identifying, interrogating, and executing witches. It became one of the best-selling books of its time, second only to the Bible. The manual described how to recognize the signs of witchcraft, how to extract confessions through torture, and how to conduct proper executions. It was a bureaucratic handbook for systematic murder, and it was used across Europe for centuries. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of medieval law was how it treated different social classes. Justice wasn't blind in the Middle Ages. It had perfect vision when it came to social hierarchy. If you were a noble accused of treason, you might be granted the honor of beheading, considered the most merciful form of execution because it was quick and relatively painless. If you were a commoner accused of the same crime, you would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. First, you would be dragged through the streets on a wooden hurdle, allowing the crowds to pelt you with garbage and stones. Then you would be hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still alive, disemboweled while conscious, and finally hacked into quarters. Your head and limbs would be displayed in different parts of the city as a warning to others. The difference wasn't accidental. It reflected the medieval belief that nobles had more refined souls that deserved more refined deaths, while commoners had coarser natures that required coarser treatment. Even in death, the social order had to be maintained. Women faced their own special category of deadly laws. Adultery, for a married woman, was punishable by death in many jurisdictions. But this wasn't about sexual morality in the way we might understand it. Women were considered property, first of their fathers and then of their husbands. Adultery was therefore a property crime, a theft of something that belonged to another man. The punishments were designed to reflect this understanding. An adulterous woman might have her head shaved and be forced to parade naked through the streets before being stoned to death. Or she might be buried alive, considered appropriate for someone who had corrupted the sacred institution of marriage. The man involved in the adultery faced punishment too, but it was usually less severe, reflecting the medieval belief that women were more responsible for sexual temptation. Religious crimes carried some of the most bizarre death sentences. Blasphemy, the act of speaking disrespectfully about God, could result in having your tongue cut out before being burned at the stake. The medieval mind believed that blasphemous thoughts originated in the physical body, so the punishment had to address both the spiritual and physical sources of the crime. Even something as simple as working on Sunday could be deadly in some communities. The Sabbath wasn't just a religious observance, it was a divine commandment, and violating it was seen as a direct challenge to God's authority. In some strictly religious communities, being caught working on Sunday could result in public flogging, imprisonment, or even death, depending on the severity of the violation and the temperament of the local authorities. The methods of execution themselves were often tailored to the crime. Counterfeiters were boiled alive in oil or water, reflecting the medieval belief that their crime of creating false money was a kind of alchemy that deserved an alchemical punishment. Poisoners met the same fate, death by the element they had used to kill others. Traitors faced the elaborate ritual of hanging, drawing, and quartering, but the specific details varied based on the nature of their treason. Those who had committed treason through words might have their tongues cut out. Those who had acted against the king with their hands might have those hands cut off before the main execution. Every element of the punishment was symbolic, designed to match the crime and send a message to potential imitators. What's particularly striking about medieval law is how it handled different types of theft. Grand larceny, defined as stealing goods worth more than 12 pence, was a capital offence. To put this in perspective, 12 pence was about 1/20th of a skilled worker's weekly wage. Today, that would be equivalent to stealing something worth maybe $50. But in medieval thinking, the value of the stolen goods wasn't the only consideration. Theft was seen as an attack on the entire social order, a rejection of the divinely ordained hierarchy that gave some people more than others. The punishment had to be severe enough to deter others from similar attacks on the social fabric. A thief wasn't just stealing property, they were stealing the peace of mind of everyone in the community, undermining the trust that held society together. Death was considered an appropriate response to such a fundamental assault on social order. But medieval law wasn't uniformly harsh. There were escape mechanisms, loopholes that could save your life if you knew how to use them. The most famous of these was benefit of clergy, a legal principle that allowed anyone who could prove they were literate to be tried in church courts rather than secular courts. Church courts couldn't impose the death penalty, so literacy could literally be the difference between life and death. The test was simple. The accused had to read a verse from the Bible, usually Psalm 51, which became known as the neck verse because it could save your neck from the hangman's noose. Many people who weren't actually clergy memorized this single verse, knowing it might someday save their lives. Others learned just enough Latin to fake their way through the reading. Churches also provided sanctuary for criminals. Anyone who could reach consecrated ground and claim sanctuary had the right to remain there for up to 40 days, protected from secular authorities. After that, they had two choices: confess their crimes and agree to permanent exile from the kingdom or face trial. Some criminals spent years living in church sanctuaries, existing in a strange legal limbo between freedom and imprisonment. These escape mechanisms reveal something important about medieval society. Despite the harsh laws and brutal punishments, there was still a recognition that mercy had its place in the divine order. The church saw itself as a counterbalance to secular authority, a source of forgiveness in a world that often seemed to offer none. But mercy was selective and often depended more on social connections than on the nature of the crime. A literate merchant might escape execution through benefit of clergy, while an illiterate peasant who committed the same crime would hang. A noble who claimed sanctuary might be quietly allowed to slip away into exile, while a commoner might find the church doors mysteriously locked when they came seeking refuge. The medieval world was one where your survival often depended not on your innocence or guilt, but on who you knew, what you could read, and how well you understood the complex web of laws, customs, and privileges that governed daily life. It was a world where knowledge was power in the most literal sense, where the difference between life and death could come down to your ability to recite a single Bible verse or your connections to the local clergy. And this was just the beginning. The laws we've explored so far, deadly as they were, represent only a fraction of the bizarre and brutal legal system that governed medieval life. There were laws that could get you killed for the clothes you wore, the food you ate, the words you spoke, and even the thoughts you thought. There were trials by ordeal, where your guilt or innocence was determined by whether you sank or floated in a pond, whether you could carry a red-hot iron bar without being burned, or whether you survived being forced to eat a piece of consecrated bread. There were laws that treated animals as legal persons, complete with trials, legal representation, and formal executions. There were punishments that continued even after death, with corpses being exhumed, tried, and executed for crimes committed while alive. There were communities where the dead could be held legally responsible for the actions of the living, and where entire bloodlines could be wiped out for the crimes of a single individual. The medieval legal system was a labyrinth of contradictions, exceptions, and deadly traps that could claim your life for reasons that would seem absurd today. But to the people who lived under these laws, they made perfect sense. They reflected a worldview where divine authority was absolute, social hierarchy was sacred, and the maintenance of order was worth any price, including human life. As we continue this journey through the strange and deadly world of medieval law, remember that these weren't abstract legal principles. They were the daily reality for millions of people who had to navigate this treacherous landscape just to survive. Every law we'll explore claimed real lives, destroyed real families, and shaped real communities in ways that echoed through generations. The medieval world wasn't just a different time. It was a different universe, governed by different rules and different values. And understanding those rules and values is the key to understanding not just medieval law, but medieval life itself. So what happened when the very fabric of society began to unravel? When the delicate balance between lord and peasant, church and crown, rich and poor started to crack under the weight of its own contradictions? The answer, my friends, lies in some of the most peculiar and deadly laws ever conceived by human minds. Let me tell you about Margaret the Scold. It's a bitter January morning in 1467 in the market town of Shrewsbury. The cobblestones are slick with frost, and smoke rises from the chimneys of half-timbered houses that lean into each other like drunken conspirators. Margaret stands in the town square, but she's not shopping for bread or haggling over the price of wool. She's locked in a metal cage called a scold's bridle, a horrific contraption designed specifically for women who dared to speak their minds too freely. Her crime? She had publicly criticised the town bailiff for taking bribes from merchants, accused the local priest of drunkenness, and worst of all, she had done so loudly, repeatedly, and with a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. In medieval England, this wasn't just unseemly behaviour for a woman. It was a crime punishable by increasingly severe penalties, culminating in what some jurisdictions called the ultimate silencing. The scold's bridle pressed against her tongue with iron spikes, making speech impossible and eating agonising. But Margaret had been here before. This was her third offence. Under the escalating punishment system used in many English towns, A fourth conviction for scolding could result in ducking, where she would be strapped to a chair and repeatedly plunged into the river until she nearly drowned. A fifth conviction, in some communities, meant death. You see, medieval society operated on the principle that social harmony was more important than individual expression. A woman who constantly criticized authority, spread gossip, or created discord wasn't just annoying, she was a threat to the cosmic order itself. The medieval mind believed that chaos began with words, that uncontrolled speech could literally unravel the divine fabric that held society together. But Margaret's story reveals something even more sinister about medieval law. The definition of scolding was deliberately vague. It could mean anything from legitimate criticism of corrupt officials to simple gossip about neighbours. The law existed not to protect society from genuine threats, but to silence women who challenged male authority in any form. The punishment escalated because medieval authorities understood something we sometimes forget today. Ideas are dangerous. A woman who publicly questioned the integrity of local officials wasn't just expressing an opinion. She was planting seeds of doubt that could grow into full-scale rebellion. Better to crush those seeds before they could take root, even if it meant crushing the woman who planted them. And crush they did. Records from various English towns show dozens of women executed for persistent scolding, their crime being nothing more than an unwillingness to accept their place in the social hierarchy. They were hanged, drowned, or in some cases, burned as witches, because a woman who refused to be silenced was clearly in league with supernatural forces. But the laws governing speech went far beyond controlling unruly women. In the intricate dance of medieval politics, words could be weapons, and the wrong words could literally cost you your head. Consider the case of William Collingbourne, a minor English gentleman who learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible. In 1484, during the reign of Richard III, William composed a short rhyme about the king and his closest advisors. 4 lines of doggerel verse that he thought were clever political commentary. He posted them on the door of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, probably chuckling to himself about his wit. The rhyme went, "The cat, the rat, and Lovell our dog, rule all England under a hog." The cat referred to William Catesby, the rat to Richard Ratcliffe, the dog to Francis Lovell, and the hog, of course, to Richard himself, whose heraldic symbol was a white boar. Clever, yes. Fatal, absolutely. Within days, William was arrested, tried for treason, and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. The charges weren't based on any actions he had taken against the crown, any plots he had joined, or any armies he had raised. He was condemned to die for 4 lines of poetry that mocked the king's appearance and questioned his advisors' competence. On November 18, 1484, William was dragged through the streets of London on a wooden hurdle, pelted with garbage and stones by crowds who had been whipped into a frenzy by royal propaganda. At Tower Hill, he was hanged until nearly dead, then cut down while still conscious. The executioner sliced open his abdomen and pulled out his intestines while William was still alive, holding them up for the crowd to see before throwing them into a fire. Only then was William beheaded and his body hacked into quarters. His head was mounted on London Bridge, where it remained for months as a warning to anyone else who might be tempted to compose witty verses about royal authority. His quartered body was sent to 4 different towns, each piece displayed on a gibbet as a reminder that even the smallest challenge to royal dignity would be met with the most extreme response. This wasn't unusual. It was policy. The medieval understanding of treason was remarkably broad, encompassing not just acts of rebellion, but thoughts, words, and even dreams that could be construed as disloyal. In some jurisdictions, simply imagining the king's death was treasonous, even if you never acted on those thoughts and never told anyone about them. The logic was twisted but internally consistent. Medieval rulers claimed to rule by divine right, appointed by God himself to govern earthly affairs. To challenge the king wasn't just political dissent, it was blasphemy, a rejection of God's chosen representative on earth. And blasphemy, as we've seen, was always punishable by death. But the most chilling aspect of these speech crimes was how they could ensnare completely innocent people. Accusations of treasonous speech were notoriously difficult to disprove, especially since the testimony of a single witness was often enough for conviction. Neighbors could settle personal grudges by claiming they had overheard seditious comments. Servants could gain freedom by testifying against their masters. Even children could condemn their parents with a few carefully chosen words. The records are full of cases where people died for things they never said, victims of perjury, misunderstanding, or deliberate malice. Medieval courts had no concept of recording testimony, no forensic methods for verifying claims, no systematic way of distinguishing truth from lies. Justice depended entirely on the credibility of witnesses and the prejudices of judges, a system practically designed to produce wrongful convictions. Take the case of Agnes Waterhouse, executed in 1566 for witchcraft largely based on the testimony of her own daughter. The child, who was probably coached by authorities eager to secure a conviction, claimed that her mother had made a pact with the devil and used supernatural powers to kill livestock and harm neighbours. Agnes protested her innocence until the very end, but her words carried no weight against the compelling narrative of demonic conspiracy that medieval minds found so believable. The execution was a community event. Entire villages would gather to watch someone burn for crimes that existed mainly in the imagination of accusers and the superstitions of judges. Children were brought to these spectacles specifically to teach them about the consequences of challenging authority or straying from accepted beliefs. The screams of the dying were considered educational, moral instruction delivered in the most visceral way possible. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval speech laws was how they encouraged self-censorship. People learned to watch their words constantly, to think twice before expressing any opinion that might be construed as criticism, to smile and nod even when they witnessed obvious injustice or corruption. The fear of accusation was often more effective than actual prosecution in maintaining social control. This atmosphere of constant surveillance and potential betrayal poisoned relationships and communities. Husbands informed on wives, children betrayed parents, friends destroyed friends, all in the name of loyalty to crown and church. Medieval society created a culture of paranoia, where trust became a luxury few could afford, and honesty became a form of suicide. The church, meanwhile, had its own elaborate system for policing speech and thought. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, developed sophisticated methods for detecting and punishing heretical ideas. Inquisitors were trained in theology, law, and psychology, skilled in the art of extracting confessions and identifying subtle forms of doctrinal deviation. The process was methodical and terrifying. Suspected heretics were arrested, often on the basis of anonymous accusations, and subjected to intensive interrogation. The questioning could last for months, with inquisitors probing every aspect of the suspect's beliefs, looking for any deviation from orthodox doctrine. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological pressure were standard techniques designed to break down resistance and force confession. If confession wasn't forthcoming, torture was authorized. The methods were carefully regulated by church law, designed to cause maximum pain while minimizing the risk of death. The goal wasn't punishment, but information. Inquisitors wanted names of accomplices, details of heretical networks, evidence of broader conspiracies against the faith. Those who confessed and recanted might escape with public penance, the wearing of special garments that marked them as former heretics, or imprisonment. but those who refused to confess, or who relapsed into heresy after confessing, faced the flames. The church couldn't shed blood directly, so convicted heretics were handed over to secular authorities for execution. But the church orchestrated every step of the process, from accusation to final sentencing. The auto da fe, the public ceremony where sentences were announced and carried out, became one of the most distinctive features of medieval religious culture. These weren't just executions. They were theatrical productions, carefully staged events designed to demonstrate the power of orthodox faith and the fate that awaited those who challenged it. Thousands would gather in public squares to watch the proceedings. The condemned would be dressed in special garments covered with images of flames and demons, marking them as enemies of God. They would be forced to listen to sermons explaining their crimes and calling on spectators to learn from their fate. Only then would they be led to the stake, where they would burn alive while crowds cheered and sang hymns. The psychological impact was enormous. These public spectacles weren't just about punishing individual heretics. They were about terrorizing entire populations into conformity, creating a climate of fear that made dissent almost impossible. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who think differently, who question authority, who refuse to accept the official version of truth. But the Church's control over speech and thought extended far beyond formal heresy trials. Medieval Christianity developed an elaborate system of confession that required believers to regularly report their thoughts, feelings, and actions to priests. This wasn't just spiritual guidance. It was systematic surveillance, a way of monitoring the inner lives of entire populations. Priests were trained to ask probing questions about not just actions, but thoughts and dreams. Had the penitent harbored doubts about church teaching? Had they experienced sexual fantasies? Had they felt anger toward authority figures? Had they questioned the justice of God's world? All of these could be signs of spiritual corruption that needed to be addressed before they led to more serious sins. The information gathered through confession was supposed to be confidential, but in practice, it often found its way to secular authorities, especially when it involved potential crimes or political disloyalty. A careless word in the confessional could lead to investigation, prosecution, and execution, making even private spiritual conversations dangerous. This system created a society where people learned to police their own thoughts, to suppress doubts and questions before they could be expressed, to maintain facades of perfect orthodoxy, even in their most private moments. The fear of spiritual and legal consequences shaped not just public behavior, but inner life, creating generations of people who learned to think in approved patterns and to distrust their own instincts and observations. The economic dimensions of medieval speech crimes were equally significant. Many of the laws governing expression were designed not just to maintain political or religious order, but to protect economic interests. Merchants who spread rumors about the quality of competitors' goods could face severe penalties. Craftsmen who criticized guild practices could be expelled from their professions. Even casual comments about market conditions or currency values could be construed as seditious if they undermined confidence in economic institutions. The medieval world was intensely local, with communities depending on networks of trust and reputation that could be easily disrupted by careless or malicious speech. A rumor about a merchant's honesty could destroy his business overnight. Gossip about a craftsman's skills could ruin his livelihood. In this environment, controlling speech wasn't just about maintaining abstract social order. It was about protecting the economic relationships that kept communities functioning. But this economic dimension of speech control also created opportunities for abuse. Wealthy merchants and guildmasters could use accusations of seditious speech to eliminate competitors or silence critics. The same laws that were supposedly designed to protect economic stability could be weaponized to maintain existing power structures and prevent economic mobility. The records show numerous cases where successful artisans or merchants were brought down by carefully orchestrated accusations of improper speech. A few witnesses claiming to have heard seditious comments, a sympathetic judge, and a competitor could be eliminated permanently. The legal system that was supposed to protect property and commerce became a tool for economic warfare, with speech crimes serving as the ammunition. Women faced particular dangers in this environment. Medieval economic law generally excluded women from most forms of independent commercial activity, but many women found ways to participate in trade, crafts, and commerce despite legal restrictions. These women were especially vulnerable to accusations of improper speech, since their very economic activity was seen as a challenge to proper gender roles. A woman who negotiated too aggressively, who criticized male competitors, or who simply succeeded too visibly in business, could find herself accused of scolding, witchcraft, or other speech-related crimes. The same words that might be praised as shrewd business sense in a man could be construed as evidence of supernatural influence or unnatural behavior in a woman. The intersection of gender, economics, and speech control created a particularly toxic environment for ambitious women. Success in business required exactly the kinds of assertive communication that medieval law defined as criminal when practiced by women. This double bind meant that women who tried to improve their economic status were almost inevitably exposing themselves to legal danger. But the most revealing aspect of medieval speech laws might be how they handled different social classes. The same words that would earn a peasant a death sentence might result in nothing more than a fine or a brief imprisonment for a noble. The same criticism of authority that would send a craftsman to the gallows might be dismissed as harmless wit when spoken by someone with the right family connections. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was policy. Medieval law explicitly recognized that different classes of people had different rights and responsibilities, including different rights to free expression. Nobles were expected to participate in political discourse, to offer advice to rulers, to engage in the kinds of debates that would be treasonous if practiced by commoners. The logic was that nobles had been born and trained to understand the complexities of governance, while commoners lacked the education and breeding necessary to form valid opinions about political matters. A noble who criticized the king might be offering valuable counsel based on superior knowledge and judgment. A peasant who said the same things was clearly stepping outside his proper role and threatening the social order. This class-based approach to speech rights created a legal system where justice depended not on what you said, but on who you were when you said it. The same sentence could be evidence of wisdom or treason, depending entirely on the social status of the speaker. Medieval courts didn't even pretend to apply laws equally across class lines. The inequality was open, acknowledged, and considered perfectly natural. Even the methods of execution reflected these class distinctions. When nobles were convicted of speech crimes, they were usually granted the privilege of beheading, considered the most honorable form of death. Commoners faced hanging, burning, or other more painful and degrading methods. Even in death, the social hierarchy had to be maintained. The church added another layer of complexity to this class-based system. Clergy could claim benefit of clergy for most crimes, including many speech offences, allowing them to be tried in ecclesiastical rather than secular courts. This meant that a priest who preached seditious ideas might face nothing more than transfer to a remote monastery, while a lay person who repeated those same ideas could burn at the stake. The intersection of class, clerical status, and speech rights created a complex web of privileges and vulnerabilities that people had to navigate carefully. A minor noble who was also a cleric had multiple layers of protection. A peasant woman had virtually none. The same legal system that protected some people's right to speak freely worked to silence others permanently. Understanding these class distinctions is crucial to understanding medieval speech laws because it reveals their true purpose. These weren't laws designed to protect society from genuinely dangerous speech. They were laws designed to maintain existing power structures by ensuring that only certain people had the right to challenge authority, criticize policy, or express dissenting views. The medieval legal system created a society where your right to speak freely depended entirely on accidents of birth, gender, and social position. It was a world where the same words could mean life or death, depending on who spoke them, who heard them, and who decided their meaning. This wasn't justice. It was social control, dressed up in the language of law and order. And this brings us to one of the most chilling aspects of medieval speech crimes: how they were used to eliminate inconvenient people. The vague definitions and subjective enforcement of these laws made them perfect tools for getting rid of anyone who posed a threat to existing power structures, regardless of whether they had actually committed any meaningful crime. Political rivals could be eliminated through carefully orchestrated accusations of treasonous speech. Economic competitors could be destroyed by witnesses claiming to have heard seditious comments. Social reformers could be silenced by charging them with heresy or blasphemy. The legal system became a weapon that could be aimed at anyone, justified by laws that were broad enough to criminalize almost any form of expression. This weaponization of speech laws created a climate of terror that went far beyond the actual executions. The knowledge that anyone could be accused at any time for almost any reason shaped behavior in profound ways. People learned to speak carefully, to avoid controversial topics, to express only approved opinions in public. Self-censorship became a survival strategy, a way of navigating a legal system that seemed designed to ensnare the unwary. But perhaps most tragically, these laws stifled exactly the kinds of speech that societies need most: criticism of corruption, challenges to unjust policies, questions about received wisdom, calls for reform and improvement. By making dissent deadly, medieval legal systems ensured their own stagnation and corruption, creating societies that couldn't adapt, couldn't reform, and couldn't progress. The people who died for speech crimes weren't usually dangerous revolutionaries or genuine threats to social order. They were often the most thoughtful, principled, and courageous members of their communities, people who cared enough about justice and truth to risk their lives speaking out against abuse and corruption. Their deaths impoverished their societies, removing voices of conscience and wisdom that might have guided positive change. The legacy of medieval speech laws extended far beyond the Middle Ages, influencing legal systems and social attitudes for centuries. The idea that certain forms of expression are inherently dangerous, that social order requires strict control over public discourse, that some people have more right to speak than others, these concepts shaped European and American law well into the modern era. Even today, we can see echoes of medieval attitudes towards speech in contemporary debates about free expression, hate speech, and the limits of acceptable discourse. The tension between maintaining social order and protecting individual expression that characterized medieval law continues to influence how we think about the proper balance between freedom and security, between individual rights and collective welfare. But understanding medieval speech laws also helps us appreciate how far we've come. The idea that people should be free to criticize authority, to express unpopular opinions, to challenge received wisdom without fear of death or imprisonment. These are relatively recent developments in human history. The rights we take for granted today were won through centuries of struggle against legal systems that treated dissent as treason and independent thought as heresy. The men and women who died for speech crimes in medieval Europe weren't just victims of a harsh legal system. They were martyrs for ideas that would eventually transform the world. The notion that truth emerges through open debate rather than official decree, that progress requires the freedom to challenge existing arrangements, that human dignity includes the right to speak one's mind without fear of violent retribution. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They were the price paid for the freedoms we enjoy today, reminders of what we lose when we allow fear to silence dissent and conformity to replace critical thinking. In remembering their stories, we honor not just their courage, but the principles they died defending. principles that remain as relevant today as they were 500 years ago. As we continue our journey through the bizarre and deadly world of medieval law, we'll discover that speech crimes were just the beginning. The medieval legal system found ways to criminalize not just words, but thoughts, dreams, and even unconscious actions. It created categories of crime that seem almost supernatural in their scope and severity, revealing a worldview so different from our own that it might as well belong to an alien civilization. But for now, remember Margaret the Scold, locked in her iron bridle for the crime of speaking her mind. Remember William Collingbourne, quartered for 4 lines of poetry that mocked a king's appearance. Remember Agnes Waterhouse, burned alive because her daughter's testimony convinced a court that she had made a pact with the devil. These weren't monsters or criminals in any meaningful sense. They were ordinary people who found themselves on the wrong side of laws designed not to protect society, but to silence dissent, maintain inequality, and preserve the power of those who benefited from an unjust system. Their stories remind us that the right to speak freely, to criticize authority, to express unpopular opinions, isn't a natural law or divine gift. It's a hard-won achievement that required the sacrifice of countless individuals who chose truth over safety, principle over survival, and conscience over conformity. The economic laws of medieval Europe created a labyrinth of death traps that could ensnare anyone foolish enough to challenge the established order of commerce and trade. These weren't just regulations about fair business practices or taxation. They were fundamental assertions about who had the right to prosper, who could engage in certain types of commerce, and what happened to those who dared to step outside their designated economic roles. Picture young Edmund the counterfeiter, if you will. It's the autumn of 1392, and he's hunched over a crude workbench in the cellar of his father's bakery in the bustling market town of Canterbury. The flickering candlelight casts dancing shadows on his concentrated face as he carefully files the edges of a silver coin, removing precious metal bit by bit. He's not trying to get rich quick. He's trying to survive. You see, Edmund's family bakery is failing. The harvest has been poor, grain prices have soared, and his father can barely afford to keep bread on their own table, let alone sell enough to pay the crushing taxes demanded by both Crown and Church. So Edmund has hit upon what seems like a clever solution. If he can shave small amounts of silver from coins and accumulate enough precious metal, he can sell it to a travelling merchant and buy enough grain to keep the bakery running through winter. It's a victimless crime in his mind. He's only taking tiny amounts from each coin, barely noticeable to the casual observer. The coins still function as currency. The king's image is still clearly visible. What harm could there be in removing a few slivers of metal that no one would ever miss? But Edmund doesn't understand the medieval mindset about currency and royal authority. To the medieval legal system, coins weren't just pieces of metal with agreed-upon value. They were physical manifestations of royal power, blessed symbols of the king's divine authority to control the economic life of the realm. The king's image on each coin wasn't decoration. It was a sacred representation, a tiny portrait of God's chosen representative on earth. When Edmund files away slivers of silver, he's not just stealing metal. He's defacing the king's image, literally diminishing the physical representation of royal authority. He's engaging in a form of symbolic violence against the crown itself, an act of treason disguised as petty theft. The penalties for counterfeiting reflected this understanding. In England, coin clippers and counterfeiters faced one of the most horrific deaths imaginable, being boiled alive in oil or water. The method was chosen deliberately, a form of alchemical justice that matched the crime. Since counterfeiters were seen as practicing a form of evil alchemy, transforming the king's sacred currency into base imitations, they would die by the same element they had corrupted. Edmund's fate was sealed the moment his neighbour, a competing baker named Thomas, noticed him acting suspiciously and decided to investigate. Medieval communities were intensely scrutinized environments where privacy was virtually non-existent, and neighbors watched each other with the vigilance of professional spies. Thomas had his own reasons for wanting Edmund's family to fail. With one less bakery in town, he could charge higher prices and attract more customers. So when Thomas discovered Edmund's nighttime activities, he saw an opportunity to eliminate a competitor while demonstrating his own loyalty to the crown. He reported his suspicions to the local sheriff, who organized a search of Edmund's premises. The evidence was overwhelming: filed coins, silver shavings, crude tools for metalworking, and Edmund's panicked attempts to destroy the evidence only made him look more guilty. The trial was a formality. Medieval courts dealing with counterfeiting cases were less interested in determining guilt or innocence than in making examples of those who dared to tamper with royal currency. Edmund's youth, his family's financial desperation, and his obvious lack of criminal intent were irrelevant. He had committed a crime against the very foundation of royal authority, and the punishment had to be severe enough to deter others from similar acts. On a cold December morning, Edmund was dragged to the market square where his family had sold bread for 3 generations. A large cauldron of water had been set up over a roaring fire, steam rising from its surface like incense from a demonic altar. The entire town was required to attend, including Edmund's parents and younger sister, who were forced to watch as their son and brother paid the ultimate price for trying to save their family business. The execution was deliberately slow. Edmund was lowered into the scalding water gradually, his screams echoing off the stone walls of surrounding buildings. The crowd was expected to cheer, to demonstrate their approval of royal justice and their rejection of anyone who would dare challenge the king's authority over currency. Those who remained silent or showed sympathy for the condemned could find themselves under suspicion of harboring similar treasonous thoughts. But Edmund's story reveals something even more sinister about medieval economic law. His neighbor Thomas, who had reported him, was rewarded with a portion of the confiscated property from Edmund's family. The bakery, the family home, all of their possessions were seized by the crown and then redistributed to those who had demonstrated loyalty by exposing the crime. This created a system of economic surveillance where neighbors were incentivized to destroy each other financially. Reporting economic crimes wasn't just civic duty, it was a business opportunity, a way to eliminate competitors and acquire their property with the full backing of royal authority. The surviving members of Edmund's family were left destitute, banned from engaging in any form of commercial activity within the town limits. They joined the growing ranks of economic refugees who wandered from place to place, begging for work and struggling to survive in a system that offered no second chances for those who had been tainted by association with economic crimes. But counterfeiting was just one of dozens of economic activities that could result in death sentences. The medieval world operated on the principle that certain types of commerce were inherently linked to social status, and engaging in trade above your designated station was a form of rebellion that threatened the entire social order. Take the sumptuary laws, legal regulations that dictated what people could wear, eat and own based on their social class. These weren't suggestions or social customs. They were legally enforceable restrictions backed by increasingly severe penalties, including death for repeat offenders who refused to accept their place in the economic hierarchy. Consider the case of Isabella the Silk Merchant, a fictional character based on numerous real cases from 14th century Florence. Isabella was born into a family of wool workers, respectable craftspeople, who occupied a secure but modest position in the city's complex social structure. She was intelligent, ambitious, and skilled at business, qualities that might be praised in a modern context, but were considered dangerous in a woman of her social class. Through years of careful saving and shrewd trading, Isabella managed to accumulate enough capital to begin importing silk from the East, a luxury commodity that was supposed to be the exclusive domain of established merchant families with proper social credentials. She started small, selling to wealthy customers who appreciated her competitive prices and excellent quality. But Isabella's success violated fundamental principles of medieval economic law. Silk trading wasn't just about buying and selling luxury goods. It was about maintaining the social boundaries that kept society stable and hierarchical. When a wool worker's daughter began competing with established silk merchants, she wasn't just engaging in commerce. She was challenging the divine order that assigned people to specific economic roles based on their birth and social position. The established silk merchants, threatened by Isabella's success, appealed to the city authorities using laws that explicitly prohibited people from engaging in trade above their designated social station. They argued that Isabella's activities were disrupting the natural order, confusing social boundaries, and setting a dangerous precedent that could encourage other lower-class individuals to abandon their proper roles. The authorities agreed. Isabella was charged with economic treason, defined as engaging in commerce inappropriate to her social class. The penalty structure was designed to give her multiple opportunities to return to her proper place, but Isabella's stubborn refusal to abandon her successful business ultimately sealed her fate. First, she was fined an enormous sum, intended to bankrupt her and force her out of the silk trade. When she managed to pay the fine and continue her business, she was publicly humiliated, forced to stand in the marketplace, wearing signs that identified her as someone who had attempted to rise above her station. But Isabella persisted. Her business was thriving, her customers were loyal, and she couldn't understand why her success was being treated as a crime. This persistence was interpreted as evidence of supernatural influence. How else could a woman of low birth continue to defy authority and succeed in business despite official opposition? The charges were expanded to include witchcraft. Isabella's business success was presented as evidence that she had made a pact with demonic forces, trading her soul for the supernatural ability to compete with her social superiors. Her refusal to confess or abandon her business was taken as proof of her guilt. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of medieval legal logic. Isabella's success in business was evidence of supernatural assistance. Her refusal to confess was evidence of demonic influence. Her continued defiance of authority was evidence of her corruption by evil forces. Every aspect of her behavior was interpreted through a lens that made conviction inevitable. The execution was designed to serve multiple purposes. As a woman accused of witchcraft, Isabella was burned at the stake, but the ceremony was structured to emphasize the economic aspects of her crimes. Her silk goods were burned with her, and the ashes were scattered in the wind as a symbol of what happened to those who tried to rise above their designated economic station. But the most chilling aspect of Isabella's case was how it affected other women in similar situations. Word of her fate spread throughout the trading networks of medieval Europe, serving as a warning to any woman who might be tempted to engage in ambitious commercial activity. The message was clear. Success beyond your assigned social role was evidence of supernatural corruption, and supernatural corruption was punishable by death. The economic laws of medieval Europe created a system where upward mobility was not just difficult, but literally deadly. The same qualities that modern societies value, ambition, innovation, entrepreneurial spirit, were treated as evidence of criminal intent or demonic influence. But the restrictions went beyond individual cases like Isabella's. Entire categories of economic activity were reserved for specific social classes, with death sentences awaiting those who crossed these boundaries. Jewish communities, for example, were often restricted to certain types of commerce, particularly money lending, which was forbidden to Christians under usury laws. This created a tragic irony where Jewish merchants were forced into occupations that made them essential to the medieval economy, but also made them targets of religious and economic persecution. They were needed because Christian merchants couldn't legally engage in money lending, but they were hated because their success in these restricted fields was seen as evidence of greed, manipulation, or supernatural influence. The pogroms that periodically swept through medieval Europe often began with accusations of economic crimes. Jewish merchants who had become too successful, who had accumulated too much wealth, or who had gained too much influence over Christian debtors would be accused of various forms of economic treason. The charges might include currency manipulation, usury beyond legal limits, or conspiracy to control local markets. These accusations rarely required much evidence. In times of economic hardship, when crop failures or political instability created widespread poverty, Jewish communities provided convenient scapegoats for problems that had complex social and economic causes. Entire communities could be wiped out based on accusations that they had used unfair business practices to impoverish Christian neighbors. The legal proceedings that preceded these massacres were often perfunctory. Medieval courts dealing with accusations against Jewish merchants were more interested in providing legal justification for predetermined outcomes than in determining actual guilt or innocence. The economic success of Jewish communities was taken as inherent evidence of wrongdoing, since their prosperity must have come at the expense of Christian neighbors. The executions that followed were community events designed to demonstrate Christian solidarity against economic exploitation and to redistribute Jewish property among Christian neighbors. Homes, businesses, and personal possessions were seized and distributed to those who had participated in or supported the persecution. But the most insidious aspect of these economic laws was how they encouraged communities to destroy their own economic foundations. Jewish merchants and moneylenders often provided essential financial services that kept local economies functioning. When these communities were eliminated, the resulting economic disruption often made everyone poorer, but the immediate satisfaction of seizing Jewish property was enough to override long-term economic considerations. The guild system created another layer of economic restrictions that could result in death sentences for those who violated its rules. Medieval guilds weren't just professional associations. They were quasi-governmental organizations with the power to regulate every aspect of their members' economic lives and to punish those who challenged their authority. Each guild maintained strict control over who could practice specific trades, what techniques they could use, how much they could charge, and where they could sell their products. These restrictions were presented as quality control measures designed to protect consumers, but they were actually mechanisms for limiting competition and maintaining the economic privileges of established guild members. The penalties for violating guild regulations started with fines and progressed through increasingly severe punishments, including banishment, imprisonment, and in extreme cases, death. The most serious offence was practicing a trade without proper guild membership, which was considered a form of theft since it involved appropriating the economic rights that belonged exclusively to guild members. Consider the case of Marcus the unlicensed blacksmith. Based on records from various German cities during the 15th century, Marcus had learned his trade from his father, who had been expelled from the local blacksmith's guild for political reasons that had nothing to do with his professional competence. Despite his skills and the community's need for his services, Marcus was forbidden from practicing his trade within the city limits. But Marcus's family needed income, and his neighbours needed someone to shoe their horses and repair their tools. So he set up a small forge outside the city walls and began accepting customers who were willing to travel the extra distance for his services. His prices were lower than those charged by guild blacksmiths, and his work was of excellent quality. The guild blacksmiths saw Marcus as a direct threat to their economic monopoly. They complained to city authorities that Marcus was stealing customers who rightfully belonged to licensed guild members. They argued that his activities were undermining the entire guild system and setting a dangerous precedent that could encourage other unlicensed craftsmen to challenge guild authority. The initial response was to expand the guild's jurisdiction to include the area where Marcus had set up his forge. When he was ordered to cease operations and refused, he was charged with economic treason and theft of guild property. The theory was that the right to practice blacksmithing within the region belonged collectively to guild members, and Marcus was stealing this right by operating without permission. The trial focused not on the quality of Marcus's work or the benefit he provided to the community, but on the danger his defiance posed to the entire economic system. If unlicensed craftsmen were allowed to operate freely, what would prevent the complete breakdown of guild authority? How could quality be maintained, prices regulated, and social order preserved if anyone could practice any trade they chose? Marcus's execution was designed to send a message to other potential violators of guild authority. He was hanged in the marketplace during the busiest trading day of the week, with representatives from all the major guilds required to attend. His tools were publicly destroyed, and his family was forbidden from engaging in any form of metalworking. But the most chilling aspect of Marcus's case was how it affected innovation and economic development. Medieval guilds often prohibited the use of new techniques or technologies that might give individual members advantages over their colleagues. This meant that craftsmen who developed improved methods faced the choice between hiding their innovations or risking expulsion from the guild for unfair competition. The result was a system that actively discouraged the kind of innovation and improvement that drives economic progress. Talented craftsmen learned to suppress their creativity, to avoid developing better methods that might be seen as threats to guild solidarity. The fear of punishment for economic innovation created a culture of stagnation that kept entire industries trapped in outdated practices. The Church added another layer of complexity to medieval economic law through its teachings about usury, profit, and the proper relationship between spiritual and material concerns. Christian doctrine taught that charging interest on loans was sinful, that excessive profit was evidence of greed, and that merchants who became too wealthy were endangering their souls. These teachings were enforced through both canon law and secular legislation that could result in severe penalties for those who violated church teachings about economic morality. Merchants who charged interest, traders who made excessive profits, or anyone who seemed to prioritize material gain over spiritual concerns could face charges ranging from heresy to economic treason. The definition of excessive profit was deliberately vague, allowing church and secular authorities to target successful merchants who had become too powerful or influential. A merchant who undercut competitors might be accused of charging unfairly low prices to drive others out of business. A merchant who charged market rates might be accused of profiteering. Success itself became suspicious, evidence of moral corruption that required investigation and punishment. The penalties reflected the Church's belief that economic sins were spiritual crimes that contaminated not just the individual, but the entire community. Merchants convicted of usury might have their property confiscated and distributed to the poor, but they might also face public penance, excommunication, or in extreme cases, death sentences for persistent violation of church teachings about economic morality. The intersection of religious and economic law created particularly dangerous situations for merchants who dealt with international trade. Contact with non-Christian merchants, especially Muslims and Jews, was necessary for access to luxury goods and exotic commodities, but it also created suspicion about the orthodoxy of Christian merchants who engaged in such trade. Merchants who spent too much time in non-Christian territories, who learned foreign languages, or who seemed too comfortable with non-Christian business practices could face accusations of religious contamination. Their success in international trade might be attributed to their willingness to compromise Christian principles, making them targets for both religious and economic persecution. The trials that resulted from these accusations often focused more on the merchant's spiritual state than on any specific economic crimes. Had they maintained proper Christian practices while abroad? Had they been tempted by foreign religious ideas? Had they prioritized profit over spiritual concerns? The answers to these questions could determine whether a successful merchant continued to prosper or faced execution for apostasy. Women face particular challenges in navigating medieval economic law because their participation in commerce was seen as inherently problematic. Medieval society believed that women's primary roles were domestic and reproductive, and excessive involvement in economic activity was evidence of neglect of these proper duties. Successful businesswomen were automatically suspect, their achievements attributed to improper means rather than skill or hard work. A woman who managed to accumulate significant wealth might be accused of using sexual influence to manipulate male customers or business partners. A woman who succeeded in male-dominated trades might be accused of witchcraft or supernatural assistance. The penalties for women who violated economic gender roles were often more severe than those faced by men who committed similar crimes. This reflected the medieval belief that women who stepped outside their designated roles were more dangerous to social order than men who did the same, since female economic independence threatened the entire patriarchal system. The legal proceedings against successful businesswomen often combined accusations of economic crime with charges of sexual impropriety or supernatural influence. A woman's business success became evidence of her moral corruption, which in turn became evidence of her criminal intent. The same achievements that might earn a man respect and recognition could earn a woman a death sentence. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of medieval economic law was how it handled economic relationships between different social classes. The medieval world operated on the principle that economic interactions should reinforce rather than challenge social hierarchies, and any economic activity that seemed to blur class distinctions was inherently suspicious. Peasants who accumulated too much wealth, craftsmen who began living like nobles, merchants who gained political influence, all of these represented threats to the divine order that assigned people to specific social and economic roles based on their birth rather than their achievements. The laws that governed these relationships were designed to prevent upward mobility and maintain clear distinctions between social classes. A peasant who became too prosperous might be accused of theft, since his wealth must have come from cheating his social superiors. A craftsman who began dressing like a noble might be charged with fraud, since he was misrepresenting his social status. A merchant who gained political influence might be accused of corruption, since such influence properly belonged to those born to rule. The death sentences that resulted from these accusations served multiple purposes. They eliminated individuals who threatened existing social arrangements. They redistributed wealth from successful lower-class people to established elites, and they sent clear messages about the consequences of attempting to rise above one's designated station. The communities that witnessed these executions learned to police themselves, to report neighbors who seemed to be accumulating too much wealth or influence, to maintain the social boundaries that kept everyone in their proper place. Economic surveillance became a community responsibility, with neighbors incentivized to destroy each other's prosperity in the name of maintaining social order. The long-term consequences of these economic laws were devastating for medieval society. They created systems that actively discouraged innovation, entrepreneurship, and economic development. They channeled human energy into maintaining existing arrangements rather than creating new opportunities. They made economic success dangerous and economic failure a virtue. The medieval world that resulted from these laws was one where poverty was seen as spiritually pure, where innovation was treated as rebellion, where success was evidence of corruption. It was a world that actively sabotaged its own economic development in the name of maintaining social and spiritual order. The merchants, craftsmen, and entrepreneurs who died under these laws weren't criminals in any meaningful sense. They were often the most capable and creative members of their communities, people whose talents and energy could have contributed to general prosperity and improvement. Their deaths impoverished not just their families but entire societies, removing exactly the kinds of people who could have driven economic progress and social development. But these economic laws also reveal something important about how medieval people understood the relationship between individual achievement and social order. they genuinely believed that unrestricted economic competition would lead to chaos, that allowing people to rise above their designated stations would undermine the divine order that held society together. From their perspective, the death sentences imposed on successful merchants and craftsmen weren't cruel persecution of talented individuals. They were necessary sacrifices to maintain the social stability that protected everyone from the chaos that would result if people were allowed to pursue unlimited economic advancement. This worldview seems alien to modern sensibilities, but it was internally consistent and reflected deeply held beliefs about divine authority, social responsibility, and the proper relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare. The medieval people who enforced these laws weren't monsters. They were people trying to maintain what they saw as a divinely ordained system that protected society from the destructive effects of uncontrolled economic competition. Understanding this mindset is crucial to understanding medieval economic law, because it reveals that these weren't arbitrary restrictions imposed by tyrants seeking to maintain their power. They were systematic attempts to solve real problems. How do you maintain social stability in a hierarchical society? How do you prevent economic competition from destroying community solidarity? How do you balance individual achievement with collective welfare? The medieval answers to these questions involve sacrificing individual economic freedom to maintain social order, using death sentences to enforce economic restrictions, and treating business success as evidence of moral corruption. These solutions seem horrific to modern minds, but they reflected genuine concerns about the social consequences of unrestricted economic competition. The tragedy is that these laws probably prevented exactly the kind of economic development that could have improved living conditions for everyone. By restricting innovation, limiting competition, and discouraging entrepreneurship, medieval economic law helped create the poverty and stagnation that made life so difficult for most people. The successful merchants and craftsmen who were executed under these laws might have been the pioneers of economic systems that could have benefited entire communities. Their deaths removed not just talented individuals, but the innovations and improvements they might have developed, leaving medieval society trapped in economic arrangements that served the interests of established elites while impoverishing everyone else. As we continue our exploration of medieval law, we'll discover that economic restrictions were just one part of a larger system that used death sentences to maintain social, political, and religious order. The same logic that made business success dangerous also made intellectual curiosity deadly, romantic love treasonous, and independent thinking evidence of demonic influence. The medieval world created a comprehensive system of legal restrictions that touched every aspect of human life, using the constant threat of death to ensure that people remained within their designated roles and accepted their assigned places in the divine order. It was a world where stepping outside the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior could result in the most brutal forms of execution, where creativity and ambition were treated as evidence of criminal intent, where success itself became a form of treason against the cosmic order. But for now, remember, Edmund the counterfeiter, boiled alive for trying to save his family's bakery. Remember Isabella the silk merchant, burned as a witch for succeeding in business above her designated social station. Remember Marcus the unlicensed blacksmith, hanged for providing needed services without proper guild authorization. These weren't evil people who deserved their fates. They were ordinary individuals who found themselves trapped in a legal system that treated economic initiative as criminal behavior, that saw business success as evidence of moral corruption, that used death sentences to maintain economic arrangements that benefited the few at the expense of the many. Their stories remind us that the economic freedoms we take for granted today, the right to start a business, to compete freely, to succeed based on merit rather than birth, are relatively recent achievements in human history. They were won through the sacrifice of countless individuals who chose economic opportunity over safety, innovation over conformity, and individual achievement over collective approval. The medieval economic laws that killed these people weren't just ancient history. They represent ways of thinking about the relationship between individual success and social order that continue to influence economic policy and social attitudes today. The tension between encouraging individual achievement and maintaining social stability, between rewarding success and preventing inequality, between promoting innovation and preserving tradition. These are contemporary debates that echo medieval concerns about the proper balance between economic freedom and social control. Understanding medieval economic law helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but how fragile our economic freedoms remain. The same fears about social disruption, the same concerns about inequality, the same tensions between individual and collective interests that motivated medieval restrictions on economic activity continue to shape contemporary debates about regulation, taxation, and the proper role of government in economic affairs. The merchants and craftsmen who died under medieval economic law were early martyrs for principles that would eventually transform the world. The idea that people should be free to pursue economic opportunities regardless of their birth, that innovation and competition benefit society as a whole, that individual achievement can coexist with social stability. Their deaths weren't meaningless tragedies. They were the price paid for economic freedoms that we now consider fundamental human rights, reminders of what we lose when we allow fear of change to override appreciation for human creativity and enterprise. But our journey through the deadly laws of medieval Europe is far from over. We've explored how the medieval world used death sentences to control speech, maintain social hierarchies, and restrict economic activity. Now we must delve into even stranger territory, the laws that governed love, marriage, and sexual behavior, where the medieval obsession with moral purity created some of the most bizarre and brutal legal restrictions in human history. In the medieval mind, sexual behavior wasn't just a private matter between consenting individuals. It was a cosmic force that could disrupt the divine order, contaminate entire communities, and threaten the spiritual welfare of society itself. The laws that governed sexual conduct reflected this understanding, creating a system where passion could be literally deadly and love itself could become a capital crime. The sexual laws of medieval Europe reveal perhaps the most intimate and invasive aspects of the medieval legal system. These weren't just regulations about public morality or social propriety. They were detailed attempts to control the most private aspects of human behavior, backed by punishments so severe that they transformed bedrooms into potential execution chambers and made romantic love a form of Russian roulette. Let me introduce you to Catherine the Adulteress, whose story unfolds in the year 1456 in the prosperous trading city of Bruges. Catherine was 28 years old, married to Willem, a successful cloth merchant who was 20 years her senior. Their marriage had been arranged by their families when Catherine was barely 16, a business transaction disguised as a romantic union, designed to merge two profitable trading enterprises rather than unite two loving hearts. Willem was not cruel, but he was distant, absorbed in his business affairs, and seemingly indifferent to his young wife's emotional and physical needs. He travelled frequently, leaving Catherine alone for months at a time, in their grand house overlooking the canal, surrounded by luxury but starved for affection and companionship. Enter Peter, a young artist commissioned to paint religious murals for the local church. He was handsome, passionate, and everything that Willem was not. When their eyes met across the crowded marketplace on a spring morning, something electric passed between them. A recognition that would ultimately cost them both their lives. Their affair began innocently enough. Peter would visit Catherine's house on the pretext of seeking patronage for his art, staying longer each time to discuss theology, poetry, and the beauty of God's creation. But medieval society left little room for innocent friendship between men and women, especially when one of them was married. Every conversation was scrutinized, every glance analyzed, every moment they spent together fodder for neighborhood gossip. The affair that developed between Catherine and Peter wasn't just about physical attraction. It was about two souls finding each other in a world that had denied them the right to choose their own romantic destinies. But medieval law didn't recognize the distinction between love and lust, between emotional connection and physical gratification. All extramarital relationships were equally sinful, equally criminal, and equally deserving of death. The discovery of their relationship came through the medieval equivalent of neighborhood surveillance. Catherine's servant, Maria, had been watching her mistress's behavior with growing suspicion and moral outrage. When she finally witnessed Catherine and Peter in a compromising embrace, she faced a moral dilemma that perfectly illustrates the poisonous nature of medieval sexual law. Maria could remain silent and become complicit in what the church taught was a sin against God, marriage, and social order. Or she could report what she had seen and watch her mistress, whom she had served faithfully for years, face a death sentence. Medieval law didn't allow for middle ground, for private conversation or gentle correction. Adultery was a public crime that demanded public exposure and public punishment. Maria chose loyalty to church and crown over loyalty to her mistress. She reported her suspicions to the local magistrate, setting in motion a legal process that would destroy 3 lives and traumatize an entire community. The investigation that followed reveals the invasive nature of medieval sexual law. Magistrates didn't simply take Maria's word for the accusation. They conducted a thorough investigation into Catherine's private life, interviewing neighbors about her behavior, examining her correspondence, even questioning merchants about what she had purchased and when. They discovered that Catherine had bought expensive perfumes and silk undergarments, evidence that she was attempting to make herself attractive to someone other than her husband. They found that she had been attending church more frequently, but at times when Peter was also present, suggesting that religious devotion was merely a cover for romantic meetings. Most damning of all, they found letters written in Catherine's hand, containing poetry that seemed to reference secret meetings and forbidden love. The letters never explicitly mentioned adultery, but medieval courts were adept at reading between the lines, finding evidence of sexual impropriety in the most innocent expressions of affection. The trial that followed was as much about public entertainment as legal justice. Medieval communities treated adultery trials like modern societies treat celebrity scandals, opportunities to indulge in moral outrage while secretly enjoying the salacious details of other people's private lives. Catherine and Peter were tried separately, but their fates were intertwined from the moment of accusation. The evidence against them was largely circumstantial, but medieval sexual law operated on the principle that reputation and appearance were more important than absolute proof. The fact that they had been seen together, that they had exchanged meaningful glances, that she had purchased expensive items, suggested that she was preparing for romantic encounters, became the foundation for her conviction. The trial proceedings reveal the gender bias inherent in medieval sexual law. While both Catherine and Peter faced death sentences, the focus of legal attention was overwhelmingly on Catherine's behavior. Medieval courts operated on the assumption that women were the primary instigators of sexual sin, that their natural tendency toward temptation made them more responsible for adultery than their male partners. Catherine was subjected to intimate physical examination by a panel of older women appointed by the court, a humiliating procedure designed to detect signs of recent sexual activity. The examination was conducted in public, with magistrates present to ensure that the female examiners reported their findings accurately. This violation of privacy was considered necessary because medieval law treated women's bodies as evidence in sexual crime cases. The physical examination revealed nothing conclusive, but the court interpreted even this negative result as suspicious. How could a woman engaged in an adulterous affair show no physical signs of her sin? The only explanation, according to medieval thinking, was that Catherine had used supernatural means to conceal the evidence of her crimes, making her not just an adulteress but a witch as well. This escalation from adultery to witchcraft charges was common in medieval sexual law cases involving women. The same patriarchal thinking that made women primarily responsible for sexual sin also made them suspects in cases involving supernatural influence. A woman who could inspire passionate love in a man, who could maintain an affair without detection, who could manipulate social situations to her advantage, was clearly operating beyond normal female capabilities. The witchcraft charges against Catherine were based on testimony from neighbours who recalled strange occurrences that could be attributed to supernatural influence. Had there been unusual sounds from her house at night? Had local cats behaved strangely in her presence? Had any neighbours experienced minor illnesses or bad luck after encountering her? Medieval communities were primed to find evidence of witchcraft in the most mundane events. A woman under suspicion for sexual crimes became a magnet for supernatural accusations, as neighbours recalled and reinterpreted ordinary occurrences through the lens of demonic influence. The most damaging testimony came from Willem himself, Catherine's husband, who had been pressured by church authorities to search his memory for signs of his wife's corruption. Under intensive questioning, Willem recalled that Catherine had sometimes spoken in her sleep, mumbling words he couldn't understand. He remembered occasions when she had seemed unusually passionate, displaying sexual enthusiasm that seemed beyond normal female behaviour. These intimate details of their marriage became evidence of Catherine's supernatural corruption. Medieval courts believed that demonic influence manifested itself through excessive sexual desire, that women who enjoyed physical intimacy too much had clearly been corrupted by evil forces. Catherine's attempts to please her husband were transformed into evidence of her alliance with the devil. Peter faced a different set of accusations, but his fate was equally sealed. As a man, he was considered less responsible for the sexual aspects of the crime, but more responsible for the social disruption it had caused. Medieval law held men accountable for maintaining social order, and Peter's affair with a married woman was seen as an attack on the institution of marriage itself. The charges against Peter focused on his role as a corrupter of female virtue. He was accused of using his artistic talents to seduce Catherine, of exploiting his access to her home to undermine her marriage, of placing his personal desires above his responsibility to maintain social harmony. But the most serious charges against Peter related to his violation of guild regulations. As an artist, he was bound by professional codes that prohibited inappropriate relationships with female patrons. His affair with Catherine wasn't just adultery, it was professional misconduct that brought dishonour to his craft and violated the trust that allowed artists to work in private homes. The Guild of Artists and Craftsmen in Bruges took these violations seriously because they threatened the reputation of all guild members. If artists could not be trusted around married women, how could they continue to receive commissions for private work? The guild's economic interests demanded that Peter be punished severely enough to demonstrate that such behaviour would not be tolerated. The sentences pronounced on Catherine and Peter reflected the different ways medieval law viewed male and female sexuality. Catherine was condemned to be buried alive, a punishment reserved for women whose sexual sins were considered so corrupting that they contaminated the very ground they touched. The burial would be preceded by public humiliation, including having her head shaved and being forced to walk through the streets wearing signs describing her crimes. Peter was sentenced to hanging, followed by his body being left to rot on the gibbet as a warning to other men who might be tempted to seduce married women. His artistic works were to be destroyed, and his name was to be removed from all guild records, erasing his professional existence as thoroughly as his execution would erase his physical life. The executions were scheduled as public spectacles, designed to educate the community about the consequences of sexual sin and to reinforce the social values that adultery laws were meant to protect. The entire population of Bruges was expected to attend, including children who would learn from witnessing the fate of those who violated sexual morality. But Catherine's story takes an unexpected turn that reveals another aspect of medieval sexual law. 3 days before her scheduled execution, Willem appeared before the magistrates with a stunning announcement. He was willing to forgive his wife's adultery and take her back as his lawful spouse, a decision that under certain interpretations of medieval law could save her life. This development created a legal crisis that exposed the contradictions inherent in medieval sexual law. On one hand, the law treated adultery as a crime against society that required public punishment regardless of the husband's wishes. On the other hand, medieval marriage law gave husbands extensive authority over their wives, including the power to forgive their sexual transgressions. The magistrates faced a dilemma. If they proceeded with Catherine's execution despite her husband's forgiveness, they would be asserting that the state's interest in punishing sexual crime superseded the husband's authority over his wife. If they commuted her sentence, they would be suggesting that serious crimes could be forgiven through private arrangements, undermining the public nature of criminal law. The solution they chose reveals the pragmatic flexibility that often characterized medieval legal systems despite their reputation for rigid brutality. Catherine's death sentence was commuted to public penance, a punishment that satisfied the community's need for moral education while respecting Willem's marital authority. The public penance imposed on Catherine was designed to be almost as humiliating as execution while allowing her to survive. She was required to walk barefoot through the streets of Bruges, wearing only a white shift and carrying a candle, stopping at each church to confess her sins publicly and beg forgiveness from God and the community. This ritual had to be performed once a month for an entire year, ensuring that Catherine's shame would be refreshed regularly in the public memory. Between these monthly humiliations, she was required to wear special clothing that identified her as a reformed adulteress, making her sexual past visible to everyone she encountered. The conditions of Catherine's survival were designed to transform her into a living example of repentance and redemption. Her continued existence in the community served as both a warning about the consequences of sexual sin and a demonstration of the Church's mercy toward those who truly repented their crimes. But Catherine's reprieve came at a terrible cost. The witchcraft charges against her were dropped as part of the arrangement, but the stigma of supernatural suspicion followed her for the rest of her life. Neighbors continued to watch her behavior for signs of demonic influence, ready to report any unusual activity to church authorities. Her marriage to Willem became a public spectacle, with community members monitoring their relationship for signs of reconciliation or continued discord. Every argument, every moment of tension, every display of affection was scrutinized and interpreted as evidence of Catherine's spiritual progress or moral backsliding. Peter was not so fortunate. His execution proceeded as scheduled, partly because he had no legal advocate willing to intervene on his behalf, and partly because his death was considered necessary to satisfy the guild's honor and demonstrate the serious consequences of violating professional codes. His hanging was attended by representatives from artist guilds throughout the region, men who came to witness the fate of a colleague who had betrayed the trust that allowed them to work in intimate settings with wealthy clients. The message was clear. Artistic talent provided no protection against the consequences of sexual misconduct, but Peter's death also served another purpose in the complex social dynamics of medieval sexual law. By executing the male participant while allowing the female to survive through public penance, the authorities reinforced gender stereotypes about sexual responsibility while maintaining the fiction that justice was being served. The differential treatment of Catherine and Peter reflected medieval beliefs about male and female sexuality that seemed contradictory to modern minds. Women were considered more responsible for sexual sin because of their supposedly greater susceptibility to temptation, but they were also considered more capable of redemption because of their assumed spiritual weakness. Men were considered less morally culpable for sexual crimes because of their supposed inability to resist female temptation, but they were also considered less capable of genuine repentance because of their assumed spiritual pride. These beliefs created a legal system where women faced harsher initial judgments but had more opportunities for mercy, while men faced more lenient initial treatment but fewer chances for forgiveness. The aftermath of Catherine and Peter's case rippled through the community of Bruges for years, affecting how people conducted their personal relationships and how they interpreted the behavior of their neighbors. The case became a reference point for future adultery prosecutions, establishing precedents about evidence, punishment, and the possibility of mercy. Young women in Bruges learned to be extraordinarily careful about their interactions with men, understanding that the slightest appearance of impropriety could lead to accusations that might cost them their lives. The case demonstrated that even innocent friendship between married women and unmarried men could be misinterpreted as evidence of sexual crime. Artists and craftsmen, meanwhile, learned to protect themselves through elaborate precautions when working in private homes. Many began requiring that female family members or servants be present during all interactions with female clients, creating formal barriers that protected both parties from accusations of impropriety. The case also influenced how husbands monitored their wives' behavior and how wives navigated the complex social expectations of medieval marriage. Willem's decision to forgive Catherine was seen by some as admirable mercy and by others as dangerous weakness that might encourage other women to commit similar crimes. The sexual laws that governed medieval Europe extended far beyond adultery to encompass a bewildering array of behaviours that modern people would consider private matters or personal choices. The medieval church and state collaborated to create comprehensive systems of sexual regulation that touched every aspect of intimate human behaviour. Homosexual activity, for example, was universally condemned and punishable by death throughout medieval Europe. The penalties were often more severe than those imposed for adultery because homosexuality was seen as a crime against nature itself, a violation of the divine order that governed human sexuality. The most common punishment for homosexual acts was burning at the stake, the same penalty imposed for heresy and witchcraft. This reflected the medieval belief that homosexuality was a form of spiritual corruption that contaminated not just the individuals involved, but the entire community that tolerated their presence. The trials for homosexual crimes were often conducted in secret to avoid corrupting public morals through detailed testimony about the acts involved. But the executions were public spectacles designed to demonstrate the community's rejection of sexual behavior that violated natural law and divine commandment. The evidence required for conviction in homosexual cases was often minimal, reflecting both the difficulty of proving private sexual acts and the assumption that such behavior was so unnatural that even the suspicion of guilt was probably accurate. Accusations from a single witness, especially if that witness was considered morally upright, could be sufficient for conviction. The social dynamics surrounding homosexual accusations were particularly toxic because they could be used to eliminate personal enemies or business rivals. A man who wanted to destroy a competitor might spread rumors about his sexual behavior, knowing that even unfounded accusations could result in investigation, trial, and execution. The fear of homosexual accusations influenced male behavior throughout medieval society, making men cautious about displays of affection or intimacy that might be misinterpreted. Close friendships between men became suspect, and activities like sharing beds during travel or embracing in greeting had to be conducted carefully to avoid creating scandal. Women accused of homosexual behavior faced different but equally severe consequences. Female homosexuality was often interpreted as evidence of supernatural corruption, since medieval minds couldn't imagine women engaging in sexual activity without male participation unless demonic forces were involved. The penalties for female homosexuality varied by region and legal tradition, but they often included burning, drowning, or being buried alive. The executions were justified not just as punishment for sexual crime, but as exorcism, attempts to purge demonic influence from the community. The investigation of suspected female homosexuality often involved intimate physical examinations, designed to detect signs of unnatural sexual activity. These examinations were conducted by panels of older women under the supervision of male magistrates, creating situations that were deeply humiliating and invasive. Prostitution occupied a complex position in medieval sexual law, being simultaneously condemned as sinful and tolerated as necessary. Many medieval cities maintained licensed brothels that operated under strict regulation, while also prosecuting unlicensed prostitutes who worked outside the official system. Licensed prostitutes were required to wear special clothing that identified their profession, to live in designated areas of the city, and to submit to regular medical examinations. They were also subject to curfews and restrictions on their movements that didn't apply to other citizens. But even licensed prostitution could become deadly if practitioners violated the complex regulations that governed their activities. Prostitutes who served married clients, who worked during religious holidays, who refused to submit to official supervision, or who attempted to leave the profession without permission, could face severe penalties, including death. Unlicensed prostitution was treated as a more serious crime because it operated outside official control and taxation. Independent prostitutes were seen as threats to public morality and social order, women who rejected both the constraints of marriage and the regulations of official prostitution. The penalties for unlicensed prostitution escalated with repeated offences, beginning with fines and public humiliation, and progressing through imprisonment, mutilation, and finally, execution. The progression was designed to give women multiple opportunities to reform their behaviour before imposing the ultimate penalty. But the definition of unlicensed prostitution was often broad enough to encompass women who were simply poor, unmarried, and sexually active. A woman who accepted gifts from male friends, who had relationships with multiple partners, or who lived independently without male supervision could find herself accused of prostitution even if she never explicitly exchanged sex for money. The trials for prostitution charges often focused more on the woman's general moral character than on specific evidence of commercial sexual activity. Had she attended church regularly? Did she maintain a respectable household? Was she known for modest and proper behavior? Negative answers to these questions could be used to support prostitution charges, even without direct evidence of sexual commerce. Rape, surprisingly, was treated inconsistently by medieval sexual law, with penalties that varied dramatically based on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. The rape of a noble woman by a commoner was considered a serious crime deserving of death, but the rape of a peasant woman by a noble might result in nothing more than a fine. This disparity reflected the medieval understanding of rape as primarily a property crime against the men who owned or controlled female sexuality. The rape of a virgin damaged her marriage prospects, making her less valuable to potential husbands. The rape of a married woman violated her husband's exclusive sexual rights. The penalties for rape were designed to compensate for this property damage rather than to punish sexual violence per se. A rapist might be required to marry his victim if she was unmarried, providing her with the social protection she had lost through his attack. Alternatively, he might be required to pay compensation to her father or husband. But rape cases could also result in death sentences, particularly when the crime was seen as part of a broader pattern of social disruption or political rebellion. Soldiers who raped women during wartime, bandits who combined sexual assault with robbery, or men who raped women from higher social classes could face execution as examples to others. The difficulty of proving rape in medieval courts often made prosecution problematic. The testimony of the victim was considered unreliable because women were assumed to be naturally deceptive about sexual matters. Physical evidence was difficult to interpret without modern forensic techniques. Witness testimony was rare because rape often occurred in private settings. These evidentiary problems meant that many rape cases were never prosecuted, while others resulted in acquittals despite strong evidence of guilt. But when convictions were obtained, the penalties could be severe, particularly if the case had attracted public attention or involved politically sensitive circumstances. The medieval regulation of marriage itself created numerous opportunities for death sentences related to sexual behavior. The Church's complex rules about who could marry whom, when marriages could be dissolved, and what constituted valid consent created a legal minefield that could trap unwary couples. Bigamy, the crime of being married to more than one person simultaneously, was punishable by death in many jurisdictions. The complexity of medieval marriage law, with its various forms of betrothal, informal unions, and regional variations, made it possible for people to commit bigamy accidentally while attempting to comply with local customs. The investigation of suspected bigamy often involved extensive genealogical research to determine whether previous marriages had been valid, whether proper consent had been given, and whether impediments like blood relationship or spiritual kinship had existed. These investigations could drag on for months or years while the accused remained in prison. Incest, defined much more broadly in medieval law than in modern legal systems, could result in death sentences for couples who violated complex rules about blood relationship and spiritual kinship. Medieval canon law prohibited marriage between people related within 7 degrees of kinship, a restriction that could encompass very distant relatives. The penalties for incest reflected the medieval belief that such unions violated natural law and divine commandment, producing offspring that were spiritually and physically corrupted. Incestuous couples might be burned at the stake, with their children declared illegitimate and stripped of inheritance rights. But the definition of incest extended beyond blood relationship to include spiritual kinship created through baptism and confirmation. Godparents and their godchildren were considered spiritually related and forbidden to marry. People who had served as witnesses at each other's baptisms were similarly restricted. These spiritual kinship rules created situations where couples who had been legally married for years might suddenly find themselves accused of incest if their spiritual relationships were discovered or reinterpreted. The retroactive application of these rules could destroy families and result in death sentences for people who had believed their marriages were perfectly legitimate. The enforcement of sexual law in medieval Europe revealed the intersection of religious authority, political power, and community surveillance that characterized medieval society. Church courts handled many sexual crimes, but secular authorities often imposed the actual punishments, creating complex jurisdictional arrangements that could be manipulated by those with political connections. The investigation of sexual crimes relied heavily on community informants who reported suspicious behavior to authorities. Neighbors, servants, and family members were expected to monitor each other's sexual conduct and report violations to appropriate officials. This system of sexual surveillance created communities where privacy was virtually non-existent and where personal relationships were conducted under constant scrutiny. The fear of accusation influenced how people behaved in their most intimate moments, making even lawful sexual activity subject to community judgment. The trials that resulted from sexual accusations often became community entertainment, with detailed testimony about intimate behavior providing salacious diversion from the routine hardships of medieval life. The public nature of these proceedings was intended to educate the community about proper sexual conduct, while satisfying popular curiosity about the private lives of the accused. The executions that concluded sexual crime cases were designed as moral spectacles that reinforced community values while providing cathartic release for collective anxieties about social order and spiritual purity. The crowds that gathered to watch these executions weren't just seeking entertainment. They were participating in rituals that reaffirmed their commitment to the sexual norms that the executed had violated. But the sexual laws of medieval Europe also created opportunities for mercy and redemption that reflected the complex relationship between justice and forgiveness in Christian society. The Church's emphasis on repentance and spiritual transformation allowed for commutation of death sentences in cases where the accused demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to reform. The public penance imposed as an alternative to execution served multiple purposes. It satisfied the community's need for moral education. It provided opportunities for the accused to demonstrate their spiritual transformation, and it maintained the fiction that Christian society was fundamentally merciful rather than vindictive. The long-term consequences of medieval sexual law extended far beyond the individuals who were prosecuted under its provisions. The constant threat of accusation and punishment shaped how entire societies understood sexuality, relationships, and the proper boundaries between public and private behavior. The surveillance systems created to enforce sexual law fostered cultures of suspicion and betrayal, where personal relationships were constantly monitored for signs of impropriety. The fear of sexual accusation influenced how people formed friendships, conducted business relationships, and navigated social interactions. The gender inequalities embedded in sexual law reinforced patriarchal power structures, while creating additional vulnerabilities for women who were already disadvantaged by economic and political restrictions. The double standards that made women more responsible for sexual sin, while giving men more opportunities for forgiveness, reflected and reinforced broader patterns of gender discrimination. The class distinctions that influenced sexual law enforcement demonstrated how legal systems could be manipulated to serve the interests of social elites while oppressing those with less power and fewer resources. The same sexual behavior that might result in death for a peasant could lead to minor penalties or complete immunity for a noble. But perhaps most importantly, medieval sexual law reveals how societies use the regulation of intimate behavior to maintain broader systems of social control. The death sentences imposed for sexual crimes weren't just about punishing individual transgressions. They were about enforcing comprehensive worldviews that encompassed religion, politics, economics, and social hierarchy. The men and women who died under medieval sexual law weren't necessarily more immoral or criminal than their contemporaries. They were often people who had the misfortune to be caught violating norms that everyone understood, but that were selectively enforced based on political convenience, personal vendetta, or community scapegoating. Their deaths served to maintain systems of power and privilege that benefited some members of society while oppressing others. The sexual purity that these laws claimed to protect was often a fiction that masked more practical concerns about property rights, social hierarchy, and political control. Understanding medieval sexual law helps us recognize how the regulation of intimate behavior continues to serve political purposes in contemporary societies. The same tensions between individual freedom and social order, between private choice and public morality, between equality and hierarchy that characterized medieval sexual regulation, continue to influence modern debates about sexuality, relationships, and the proper scope of legal intervention in personal behavior. The couples who died for adultery, the individuals executed for homosexual activity, the women burned as prostitutes weren't just victims of harsh legal systems. They were casualties in ongoing struggles over who has the right to define proper sexual behavior, who benefits from sexual regulation, and what price societies are willing to pay to maintain sexual conformity. Their stories remind us that the sexual freedoms we often take for granted today were won through the sacrifice of countless individuals who chose love over law, desire over duty, and personal authenticity over social approval. The right to form intimate relationships based on mutual consent rather than social arrangement, to express sexuality without fear of death or imprisonment, to make private choices about personal behavior without community interference. These are relatively recent achievements that required centuries of struggle against legal systems that treated sexual autonomy as a threat to social order. The medieval world that killed Catherine the adulteress and Peter the artist that burned homosexuals at the stake and buried unchaste women alive, wasn't an aberration in human history. It was a logical extension of beliefs about sexuality, morality, and social control that continue to influence legal systems and social attitudes throughout the world. The tragedy isn't just that these people died for behavior that we now consider normal or acceptable. The tragedy is that their deaths served to maintain systems of oppression that prevented entire societies from developing more humane and rational approaches to sexual regulation. But their sacrifices weren't meaningless. Every person who died for sexual crimes in medieval Europe contributed to a gradually growing understanding that sexual behavior is too complex and personal to be regulated through crude legal mechanisms, that societies benefit more from tolerance than from repression, and that the price of sexual conformity is often too high for civilized communities to pay. As we continue our exploration of medieval law, we'll discover that sexual regulation was just one aspect of a comprehensive system that used death sentences to control every aspect of human behavior. The same logic that made adultery deadly also made intellectual curiosity treasonous, religious doubt heretical, and social mobility evidence of supernatural corruption. The medieval world created legal systems that were designed not to serve justice in any meaningful sense, but to maintain existing power structures through the systematic application of terror. Understanding these systems helps us appreciate both how far human societies have progressed and how fragile the freedoms we now enjoy really are. The religious laws of medieval Europe created perhaps the most comprehensive and terrifying system of thought control in human history. These weren't simply regulations about proper worship or church attendance. They were detailed attempts to monitor and regulate the inner lives of entire populations, using death sentences to enforce not just outward conformity, but genuine belief in religious doctrines that many people found difficult to accept or understand. Let me tell you about Brother Marcus the Doubter, a Benedictine monk whose story unfolds in the monastery of Saint-Denis near Paris in the year 1348. Marcus had entered religious life at the age of 14, not out of divine calling, but because his impoverished family could no longer afford to feed him. The monastery offered food, shelter, and education, luxuries that his peasant background had never provided. For 20 years, Marcus had lived the regulated life of a medieval monk, rising before dawn for matins, spending his days copying manuscripts in the scriptorium, attending the endless cycle of prayers and services that structured monastic existence. To outside observers, he appeared to be a model of religious devotion, a man who had successfully surrendered worldly concerns for spiritual perfection. But beneath his outward conformity, Marcus harbored questions that grew more troubling with each passing year. The Black Death had arrived in Paris, killing nearly half the population in a matter of months. Marcus had watched helplessly as his fellow monks died agonizing deaths, their bodies covered with black boils, their final moments filled with pain and terror that seemed to mock everything he had been taught about divine mercy and justice. How could a loving God allow such suffering? If the Church's teachings about salvation were true, why did the most devout Christians seem to die as horribly as the most notorious sinners? If prayer and religious observance provided divine protection, why had the monastery's chapel become a morgue filled with the corpses of men who had dedicated their lives to God's service? These questions tormented Marcus as he continued his daily routine of prayer and study. He found himself questioning not just specific doctrines, but the entire framework of Christian belief that had structured his adult life. Was there really a God who cared about human affairs? Did the elaborate rituals of the Church have any meaning beyond social control? Was eternal salvation anything more than a comforting fiction designed to make earthly suffering bearable? Marcus knew that such thoughts were dangerous, but he couldn't stop them from arising during the quiet hours of contemplation that monastic life required. He tried to suppress his doubts through more intense prayer, longer fasts, and additional acts of penance. But the questions only grew stronger and more insistent. The crisis came during a theological discussion with Brother Thomas, a younger monk who had recently joined the community. Thomas was questioning the doctrine of transubstantiation, the Church's teaching that bread and wine were literally transformed into the body and blood of Christ during Mass. To Thomas, this seemed like obvious symbolism rather than physical reality, and he couldn't understand why the Church insisted on such literal interpretation. Marcus found himself agreeing with Thomas's doubts, and their conversation gradually expanded to encompass broader questions about church doctrine. They began meeting secretly in the monastery's garden after Compline, the final prayer service of the day, discussing theological questions that they knew were dangerous but couldn't resist exploring. Their discussions might have remained private indefinitely, but medieval monasteries were communities where privacy was virtually impossible and where the spiritual welfare of each monk was considered everyone's responsibility. Brother Augustine, an older monk who had noticed their secretive behavior, began eavesdropping on their conversations. What Augustine heard horrified him. These weren't minor theological disagreements or scholarly debates about obscure doctrinal points. These were fundamental challenges to core Christian beliefs, expressed by men who had taken sacred vows to uphold and defend church teaching. Augustine faced the same moral dilemma that had confronted Catherine's servant Maria. He could remain silent and become complicit in what the church considered spiritual treason, or he could report his fellow monks and watch them face the terrible consequences of heretical thinking. Medieval monasticism emphasized the collective responsibility of religious communities for the spiritual welfare of their members. A monk who discovered heretical thinking in his colleagues wasn't just encouraged to report it, he was morally and legally obligated to do so, regardless of personal friendships or emotional attachments. Augustine chose duty over loyalty. He reported his suspicions to Dom Benedict, the monastery's abbot, setting in motion a process that would ultimately destroy 2 lives and traumatize the entire religious community. Dom Benedict was a practical man who understood the political realities of medieval religious life. Accusations of heresy against members of his community would bring unwanted attention from church authorities, potentially resulting in investigations that could damage the monastery's reputation and endanger its financial support. But he also understood that failing to address heretical thinking could result in even worse consequences. If word of theological dissent within his community reached the Inquisition through other channels, he could be accused of harboring heretics and failing in his duty to maintain doctrinal purity. The investigation that followed reveals the sophisticated methods that medieval religious authorities had developed for detecting and prosecuting heretical thinking. Dom Benedict didn't simply confront Marcus and Thomas with Augustine's accusations. Instead, he launched a careful examination of their beliefs that was designed to determine the extent and nature of their theological deviations. The process began with private interviews conducted under the guise of spiritual counseling. Dom Benedict met with each monk separately, ostensibly to discuss their spiritual progress and address any concerns they might have about their religious life. The conversations were carefully structured to encourage the monks to express their honest thoughts about theological questions, while creating a record of any heretical statements they might make. Marcus, exhausted by months of internal struggle and desperate for spiritual guidance, found himself confessing his doubts to the abbot. He spoke about his questions regarding divine justice, his struggles with faith in the face of overwhelming suffering, his growing uncertainty about the literal truth of church doctrines. What Marcus didn't realize was that Dom Benedict was trained in the techniques of heresy detection that had been developed by the Inquisition. Every word was carefully analyzed for signs of doctrinal deviation. Every expression of doubt was catalogued and evaluated. Every question about church teaching was recorded as potential evidence of heretical thinking. The interview with Thomas yielded even more damaging results. The younger monk, perhaps more naive about the dangers of expressing theological doubts, spoke openly about his rejection of transubstantiation and his broader questions about the supernatural aspects of Christianity. He described his growing belief that much of church doctrine was metaphorical rather than literal, that religious rituals were human creations rather than divine commandments. Dom Benedict now faced a terrible decision. The evidence clearly indicated that both monks harbored heretical beliefs that violated their sacred vows and threatened the spiritual welfare of the entire community. But pursuing formal charges would bring inquisitors to his monastery, subjecting every member of the community to investigation and potentially destroying the institution he had spent his life building. The solution he chose reveals the complex relationship between different levels of religious authority in medieval Europe. Rather than reporting the case to the Inquisition, immediately, Dom Benedict chose a middle path that would protect his monastery while still addressing the heretical thinking that threatened its spiritual integrity. He decided to handle the matter internally, using the disciplinary powers granted to him as abbot to punish the offending monks without involving outside authorities. The punishment he devised was both merciful and terrifying. Marcus and Thomas would be subjected to a process of spiritual correction that would either restore their faith or break their spirits entirely. They would be confined to individual cells in the monastery's most isolated tower, denied all human contact except for daily visits from Dom Benedict himself. During these visits, the abbot would engage in intensive theological instruction designed to correct their heretical thinking. The monks would be required to copy orthodox religious texts for hours each day, write detailed confessions of their doubts and errors, and submit to psychological pressure intended to restore their faith in church doctrine. The isolation was intended to break down their resistance to orthodox teaching while protecting the other monks from contamination by heretical ideas. Medieval religious authorities understood that doubt could spread like a disease through religious communities, corrupting faithful believers who might otherwise never question church doctrine. But the correction process that Dom Benedict imposed on Marcus and Thomas was designed to be temporary. If they demonstrated genuine repentance and convincing return to orthodox belief, they would be gradually reintegrated into the monastic community. If they proved incapable of spiritual correction, they would be quietly transferred to other monasteries, or, in extreme cases, expelled from religious life entirely. Marcus responded to the correction process with a mixture of despair and stubborn resistance that made his situation increasingly dangerous. The isolation and psychological pressure intensified his doubts rather than resolving them, leading him to question not just specific doctrines, but the entire system of authority that claimed the right to control his thoughts and beliefs. During his daily sessions with Dom Benedict, Marcus found himself unable to feign the repentance that might have saved him. When asked to renounce his doubts about divine justice, he could only respond with more questions. When required to affirm his belief in transubstantiation, he found himself explaining why the doctrine seemed logically impossible. Thomas, younger and perhaps more flexible in his thinking, proved more adaptable to the correction process. He learned to express his theological questions in ways that seemed compatible with orthodox doctrine, to frame his doubts as requests for deeper understanding rather than challenges to church authority. But his apparent success in the correction process was largely performance, a survival strategy that allowed him to avoid the more severe punishments that awaited those who proved incapable of spiritual rehabilitation. Privately, his doubts remained as strong as ever, but he had learned to keep them hidden behind a facade of renewed orthodoxy. The different responses of the two monks to their punishment reveal the complex psychology of religious persecution in medieval Europe. Some individuals, when faced with the consequences of heretical thinking, genuinely convinced themselves to abandon their doubts and embrace orthodox belief. Others learned to maintain their private convictions while publicly conforming to required beliefs. Still others, like Marcus, proved psychologically incapable of the flexibility required for survival In a system that demanded absolute conformity, after 6 months of attempted correction, Dom Benedict concluded that Marcus was incapable of genuine repentance and posed a continuing threat to the spiritual welfare of the monastic community. The monk's persistent questions and obvious inability to embrace orthodox doctrine made him unsuitable for religious life and potentially dangerous to other members of the community. But simply expelling Marcus from the monastery would create new problems. A former monk wandering the countryside while harboring heretical beliefs could spread dangerous ideas among lay populations who lack the theological training to resist such contamination. The risk of allowing Marcus to leave the monastery while still maintaining his doubts was simply too great to accept. The solution that Dom Benedict chose reveals the dark reality of medieval religious life for those who proved incapable of maintaining orthodox belief. Marcus would be transferred to a remote monastery in the mountains of the Auvergne, a harsh and isolated institution that specialized in housing monks who had proven problematic for other religious communities. The monastery of Saint-Foy was less a religious community than a prison for clerics whose thinking or behavior had made them unsuitable for normal monastic life. The discipline was harsh, the living conditions deliberately austere, and the spiritual atmosphere oppressive in ways designed to break the will of those who had challenged church authority. Marcus's transfer to Saint-Foy was presented to the other monks at Saint-Denis as a routine administrative matter, a simple reassignment that reflected the monastery's commitment to helping struggling brothers find environments better suited to their spiritual needs. But everyone understood the real meaning of the transfer, and Marcus's departure served as a powerful warning about the consequences of theological dissent. The journey to Saint-Foy was itself a form of punishment, a week-long trek through mountainous terrain in the company of armed guards who treated Marcus more like a prisoner than a fellow religious. The isolation and harsh treatment during the journey were designed to reinforce his understanding of how completely he had fallen from grace and how limited his options had become. At Saint-Foy, Marcus found himself in a community of broken men, monks whose lives had been destroyed by their inability to conform to the demands of medieval religious orthodoxy. Some had been transferred for theological dissent, others for moral failures, still others for political activities that had brought disgrace to their original communities. The daily routine at Saint-Foy was designed to crush individual will and replace it with mechanical obedience to religious authority. The prayers were longer and more frequent than in normal monasteries, the fasts more severe, the work more physically demanding. Every aspect of life was structured to remind the monks of their fallen status and their complete dependence on church mercy for survival. Marcus's final fate at Saint-Foy remains unknown, lost in the fragmentary records of a monastery that preferred not to document the details of its grim mission. But the pattern of his story was repeated countless times throughout medieval Europe, as religious authorities developed sophisticated methods for identifying, isolating, and destroying those whose thinking challenged orthodox doctrine. The fate of Brother Thomas reveals the other side of medieval religious persecution, the possibilities that existed for those who proved capable of conforming to orthodox requirements while maintaining their private convictions. Thomas's apparent success in the correction process allowed him to resume his place in the monastic community, but his experience had taught him painful lessons about the dangers of honest theological inquiry. Thomas spent the remaining decades of his life as a model monk, outwardly conforming to every requirement of religious orthodoxy, while carefully concealing any thoughts that might be construed as heretical. He became skilled at expressing his intellectual curiosity in ways that seemed compatible with church doctrine, framing questions as requests for deeper understanding rather than challenges to establish truth. But the psychological cost of this double life was enormous. Thomas lived in constant fear that his true thoughts might be discovered, that some careless word or expression might reveal the doubts he continued to harbor. The stress of maintaining his facade of orthodoxy while suppressing his genuine intellectual interests took a toll on his mental and physical health that shortened his life and limited his contributions to the monastery's scholarly work. The cases of Marcus and Thomas illustrate the broader impact of religious persecution on intellectual life in medieval Europe. The systematic suppression of theological dissent didn't just destroy individual lives. It created a climate of fear that discouraged honest inquiry and independent thinking throughout religious communities. Monks learned to avoid controversial topics, to express their thoughts in carefully coded language, to suppress questions that might lead to dangerous conclusions. The result was an intellectual culture that prioritized conformity over truth, obedience over understanding, and survival over integrity. But the religious laws that governed medieval Europe extended far beyond the regulation of theological thinking. The Church claimed authority over vast areas of human behavior, using death sentences to enforce moral standards that touched every aspect of daily life. Consider the case of Marie the Sunday worker, a widow who lived in the French village of Carcassonne in the year 1321. Marie supported herself and her 2 young children by taking in laundry, a humble occupation that barely provided enough income to keep her family fed and housed. The work was physically demanding and time-consuming, requiring Marie to spend long hours washing, drying, and mending clothes for her more prosperous neighbours. During the week, she could barely keep up with the demand for her services, and the small income she earned was never quite enough to cover her family's basic needs. So when Sunday arrived, Marie faced a terrible choice. She could observe the Sabbath as church law required, attending Mass and refraining from all work while her children went hungry and her debts mounted. Or she could use the day to catch up on the laundry that would provide the few extra coins her family desperately needed to survive. Marie chose survival over religious observance. While her neighbours attended Sunday Mass, she continued working in her small cottage, washing and mending clothes by the light of a single candle. She told herself that God would understand her desperate circumstances, that providing for her children was itself a form of religious duty. But medieval Sunday laws didn't recognize exceptions for poverty or desperation. The Sabbath was considered a divine commandment that applied equally to rich and poor, powerful and weak. Work of any kind on Sunday was seen as a direct violation of God's will, a rejection of the divine order that structured the week according to sacred rather than secular concerns. Marie's Sunday work was discovered by her neighbour, Jean the baker, who had noticed smoke rising from her chimney during Mass and had become suspicious about her activities. Jean was a pious man who took his religious obligations seriously, but he was also a competitor who resented Marie's willingness to work 7 days a week when his own religious convictions limited him to 6. The accusation that Jean brought against Marie was framed in religious terms, but it was motivated by economic competition and personal resentment. By reporting Marie's Sabbath violations, Jean could eliminate a competitor while demonstrating his own religious orthodoxy, serving both his financial interests and his spiritual reputation. The investigation of Marie's case reveals the intrusive nature of medieval religious law and its enforcement. Church authorities didn't simply rely on Jean's accusation. They conducted a thorough examination of Marie's Sunday activities, interviewing neighbours about what they had observed, searching her cottage for evidence of recent work, even examining the clothes she had been washing for signs of fresh cleaning. The evidence against Marie was overwhelming. Neighbours testified that they had seen her hanging laundry on Sundays, that smoke had been observed rising from her chimney during Mass, that she had been seen working in her garden when she should have been at church. The clothes in her cottage showed clear evidence of recent washing, and the worn condition of her hands indicated that she had been working with soap and water more frequently than her weekday activities alone could explain. But the most damaging evidence came from Marie's own children, who were questioned about their mother's Sunday activities. Medieval law allowed the testimony of children against their parents in cases involving religious crimes, reflecting the belief that spiritual welfare took precedence over family loyalty. Under pressure from church authorities, Marie's 6-year-old daughter confirmed that her mother had worked on Sundays, innocently providing details about the laundry activities she had observed. The child had no understanding of the deadly implications of her testimony, but her words provided the final proof needed for Marie's conviction. The trial that followed was less a legal proceeding than a religious ceremony designed to demonstrate the consequences of violating divine commandments. Marie was charged not just with working on Sunday, but with blasphemy, since her actions showed contempt for God's explicit instructions about Sabbath observance. The penalties for Sunday work varied by region and jurisdiction, but they could be severe enough to include death sentences for repeat offenders who showed persistent disregard for religious law. Marie's case was complicated by her status as a widow and mother, which created sympathy for her desperate circumstances, while also making her behavior more scandalous. A woman who worked on Sunday wasn't just violating religious law. She was rejecting the proper role of Christian women, who were supposed to depend on male support rather than engaging in independent economic activity. Marie's Sunday work was seen as evidence of her rejection of divine providence and her prideful assumption that human effort was more reliable than trust in God's care. The sentence imposed on Marie reflected both the religious and social aspects of her crime. She was condemned to public penance that would humiliate her while educating the community about the importance of Sabbath observance. Every Sunday for a full year, she would be required to stand outside the church during Mass wearing signs that identified her as a Sabbath violator. But the penance also included economic penalties that made it impossible for Marie to continue supporting her family through her laundry work. She was forbidden from engaging in any form of commercial activity on any day of the week, effectively destroying her livelihood and forcing her to depend on church charity for survival. The children who had provided testimony against their mother were taken from her custody and placed in the care of more religiously reliable families, ostensibly to protect them from further contamination by their mother's irreligious example. Marie's family was destroyed not by poverty or disease, but by religious law that prioritized Sabbath observance over family survival. The aftermath of Marie's case rippled through the community of Carcassonne, affecting how other poor families balance their economic needs against religious obligations. The message was clear. No circumstances, however desperate, justified violation of Sunday laws. Poverty was not an excuse for irreligion, and those who chose survival over Sabbath observance would face consequences that could destroy their lives and families. But Marie's story also reveals the class bias inherent in medieval religious law. While poor women like Marie faced severe punishment for Sunday work, wealthy merchants and nobles routinely engaged in activities that violated the spirit, if not the letter of Sabbath laws. They hosted elaborate feasts that required extensive labor from servants, traveled on business that involved commercial negotiations, and engaged in political activities that were indistinguishable from work. The difference was that wealthy people could afford to hire others to perform the actual labor, while maintaining the fiction that they were observing religious law. Poor people like Marie had no such options, making them more vulnerable to prosecution for violations that were practically necessary for survival. The religious authorities who prosecuted Marie understood this inequality, but considered it part of the divine order that assigned different roles and responsibilities to different social classes. The wealthy had been blessed with resources that allowed them to observe religious law without personal hardship. The poor were being tested through adversity that required them to demonstrate faith by accepting deprivation rather than violating divine commandments. This theological interpretation of economic inequality transformed Marie's Sunday work from a practical necessity into a spiritual failing, a sign that she lacked the faith required to trust in divine providence rather than human effort. Her punishment was presented not as cruel persecution of a desperate woman, but as spiritual correction designed to restore her relationship with God. The blasphemy laws that governed medieval Europe created another category of religious crimes that could result in death sentences for behavior that modern people would consider minor offenses or protected speech. These laws reflected the medieval belief that words had supernatural power, that speaking disrespectfully about God or religious authority could literally damage the spiritual fabric of the universe. Consider the case of Guillaume the Blasphemer, a travelling merchant who found himself in mortal danger because of words spoken in a moment of frustration and anger. Guillaume was returning from a trading expedition in Flanders when his wagon broke down on a muddy road outside the city of Reims. He had been travelling for weeks. His merchandise was damaged by rain, and he faced the prospect of significant financial losses that would affect his family's welfare for months to come. In his frustration, Guillaume cursed his bad luck using language that included irreverent references to God and the saints. To Guillaume, these were simply expressions of anger and disappointment, no different from any other profanity he might use to vent his emotions. But to the group of pilgrims who overheard his outburst, Guillaume's words were evidence of blasphemous thinking that threatened the spiritual welfare of everyone within earshot. Medieval blasphemy law was based on the belief that disrespectful language about God or religious figures could invoke divine wrath that might affect entire communities. Guillaume's curses weren't just personal expressions of frustration. They were dangerous spiritual contamination that could bring plague, famine, or military defeat to innocent people who happened to be nearby when the offensive words were spoken. The pilgrims who heard Guillaume's blasphemy faced a moral obligation to report his words to religious authorities. Failing to do so would make them complicit in his spiritual crime and potentially subject them to divine punishment for their silence. Medieval religious law didn't allow for privacy or tolerance when it came to blasphemous speech. The accusation against Guillaume was brought before the ecclesiastical court in Reims, where blasphemy cases were handled as serious religious crimes, requiring careful investigation and severe punishment. The court's first task was to determine exactly what Guillaume had said and whether his words met the legal definition of blasphemy that could warrant death sentences. The investigation involved detailed testimony from the pilgrims who had overheard Guillaume's outburst, careful analysis of the specific words he had used, and theological evaluation of whether his language constituted genuine blasphemy or merely inappropriate but forgivable profanity. Medieval courts drew fine distinctions between different types of irreverent speech, with some forms warranting minor penalties while others deserved death. The testimony of the pilgrim witnesses painted a picture of Guillaume as a man whose anger had led him to speak in ways that showed contempt for divine authority. They described not just his specific words, but his tone of voice, his facial expressions, and his general demeanor, all of which were considered relevant to determining his spiritual state and the seriousness of his offense. But the most damaging aspect of the testimony was its description of Guillaume's apparent lack of immediate repentance for his blasphemous words. When the pilgrims had expressed shock at his language, Guillaume had not apologized or shown remorse. Instead, he had defended his right to express frustration and had dismissed their concerns as excessive religious scrupulosity. This lack of immediate repentance was interpreted as evidence that Guillaume's blasphemy was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but a reflection of deeper irreligious attitudes that made him dangerous to community spiritual welfare. A man who blasphemed in anger might be forgiven if he showed proper remorse. A man who defended his right to blaspheme was clearly corrupted by pride and contempt for divine authority. The theological analysis of Guillaume's specific words involved consulting scholarly texts about the nature of blasphemy and the supernatural consequences of irreverent speech. Medieval theologians had developed elaborate classifications of blasphemous language, distinguishing between different degrees of offense based on the specific divine attributes that were being disparaged. Guillaume's curses were determined to fall into the category of direct blasphemy against God's justice and providence, since he had essentially accused God of treating him unfairly and had expressed doubt about divine care for human welfare. This was considered more serious than indirect blasphemy, that simply used religious names as profanity without directly challenging divine attributes. The penalty for Guillaume's blasphemy reflected both the religious and social dimensions of his crime. As a merchant who travelled frequently and interacted with people from many different communities, Guillaume was considered especially dangerous because his blasphemous attitudes could spread spiritual contamination across wide geographical areas. The sentence imposed on Guillaume was designed to serve multiple purposes: punishment for his specific crime, education for the community about the seriousness of blasphemous speech, and prevention of future spiritual contamination through elimination of a source of irreligious influence. Guillaume was condemned to have his tongue pierced with a red-hot iron before being burned at the stake, a punishment that symbolically addressed the organ that had produced the blasphemous words, while also providing the purification through fire that medieval theology considered necessary for serious spiritual crimes. But Guillaume's case took an unexpected turn that reveals the complex relationship between secular and religious authority in medieval Europe. Before his sentence could be carried out, Guillaume's merchant guild intervened on his behalf, arguing that his execution would disrupt important trading relationships and damage the economic interests of the city. The guild's intervention created a conflict between religious law, which demanded severe punishment for blasphemy, and economic interests, which required maintaining good relationships with travelling merchants who might not always conform to local religious standards. The resolution of this conflict reveals the pragmatic flexibility that often characterized medieval legal systems, despite their reputation for rigid orthodoxy. A compromise was reached that satisfied both religious and economic concerns. Guillaume's death sentence was commuted to a series of public penances that would humiliate him while educating the community about the seriousness of blasphemous speech, but his life would be spared to preserve important commercial relationships. The public penance imposed on Guillaume was designed to be almost as effective as execution in deterring future blasphemy, while allowing him to survive and continue his trading activities. He was required to walk barefoot through the streets of Reims, wearing signs that identified him as a blasphemer, stopping at each church to publicly confess his sins and beg forgiveness from God and the community. This ritual of humiliation had to be performed not just once, but repeatedly over the course of a full year, ensuring that Guillaume's shame would be regularly refreshed in the public memory, and that his case would serve as an ongoing example of the consequences of blasphemous speech. Between these public penances, Guillaume was required to wear special clothing that marked him as a reformed blasphemer, making his spiritual past visible to everyone he encountered in his commercial activities. This permanent marking served as both punishment and warning, protecting potential customers from spiritual contamination, while constantly reminding Guillaume of his fallen status. The conditions of Guillaume's survival also included restrictions on his commercial activities that reflected the connection between his blasphemy and his role as a travelling merchant. He was forbidden from trading in religious articles or conducting business near churches, limitations that reduced his earning potential while protecting religious spaces from contamination by his presence. Guillaume's case demonstrates how medieval blasphemy law created a system where words could be literally deadly, where moments of anger or frustration could result in accusations that threatened life itself. The law recognized no distinction between public and private speech, no allowance for emotional outbursts, no tolerance for irreverent language regardless of the circumstances that provoked it. The enforcement of blasphemy law relied on a system of community surveillance, where everyone was expected to monitor the speech of their neighbours and report violations to religious authorities. This created an atmosphere where casual conversation became dangerous, where people learned to guard their words constantly, where even private expressions of frustration could become evidence of spiritual corruption. The psychological impact of living under such restrictions was enormous. People learned to suppress not just blasphemous speech, but any language that might be construed as irreverent or disrespectful. The fear of accusation influenced how individuals expressed anger, disappointment, or criticism, forcing them to find alternative outlets for emotions that couldn't be safely verbalized. The social consequences of blasphemy law extended beyond individual cases like Guillaume's to affect entire communities. The constant threat of accusation created divisions between neighbours, encouraged informants and spies, and transformed ordinary social interactions into potential legal hazards. But perhaps most significantly, blasphemy law served to reinforce religious authority by making criticism of church doctrine or clerical behavior extremely dangerous. People who might otherwise question religious teachings or challenge clerical corruption learned to keep their doubts private, creating an environment where religious authority could operate without fear of public accountability. The heresy laws that governed medieval Europe created the most comprehensive system of thought control in human history, using death sentences to enforce not just outward conformity, but genuine belief in religious doctrines that many people found difficult to understand or accept. These laws reached into the deepest recesses of human consciousness, making private thoughts and personal beliefs matters of life and death. The Inquisition, established in the 13th century, developed sophisticated methods for detecting and prosecuting heretical thinking that went far beyond anything Guillaume the Blasphemer or Brother Marcus had faced. Inquisitors were trained theologians, lawyers, and psychologists who understood how to identify subtle forms of doctrinal deviation and extract confessions from even the most reluctant suspects. The process of heresy investigation was methodical and terrifying. Suspected heretics were arrested based on accusations that could come from anyone: neighbors, servants, family members, even children. The accusations didn't need to be specific or detailed. Simply reporting that someone had expressed unusual religious ideas or asked suspicious questions could be enough to trigger an investigation. Once arrested, suspects were subjected to intensive interrogation designed to uncover not just their own heretical beliefs, but information about others who might share similar ideas. The questioning could last for months, with inquisitors using sleep deprivation, isolation, psychological pressure, and eventually torture to break down resistance and force confession. The torture, authorized by church law, was carefully regulated, designed to cause maximum pain while minimizing the risk of death. Inquisitors wanted living confessions, not dead martyrs. The methods included the strappado, where suspects were hung by their wrists with weights attached to their feet; the rack, which stretched the body until joints separated; and water torture, where suspects were forced to swallow large quantities of water until they felt they were drowning. But physical torture was often unnecessary. The psychological pressure of months of interrogation, combined with the knowledge that torture would inevitably follow if confession wasn't forthcoming, was usually enough to break down even the strongest resistance. Most suspects eventually confessed to whatever charges were brought against them, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. The confessions extracted by inquisitors weren't simple admissions of guilt. They were detailed catalogues of heretical beliefs, descriptions of forbidden practices, and most importantly, lists of names of others who shared similar ideas. Each confession became the foundation for new investigations, creating networks of accusation that could destroy entire communities. Those who confessed and demonstrated genuine repentance might escape with public penance, imprisonment, or confiscation of property. But those who refused to confess, or who relapsed into heresy after confessing, faced the flames. The church couldn't shed blood directly, so convicted heretics were handed over to secular authorities for execution, but the church orchestrated every step of the process. The auto da fe, the public ceremony where sentences were announced and carried out, became one of the most distinctive features of medieval religious culture. These weren't just executions, they were theatrical productions, carefully staged events designed to demonstrate the power of orthodox faith and the fate that awaited those who challenged it. The condemned would be dressed in special garments called sanbenitos, yellow robes covered with images of flames and demons that marked them as enemies of God. They would be forced to listen to sermons explaining their crimes and calling on spectators to learn from their fate. Only then would they be led to the stake, where they would burn alive while crowds sang hymns and celebrated the triumph of orthodoxy over heresy. The psychological impact of these public spectacles was enormous. They weren't just about punishing individual heretics. They were about terrorizing entire populations into conformity, creating a climate of fear that made dissent almost impossible. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who think differently, who question authority, who refuse to accept the official version of truth. But the reach of heresy law extended far beyond formal trials and public executions. The mere suspicion of heretical thinking could destroy lives, ruin careers, and devastate families. People learned to guard their thoughts as carefully as their words, to suppress doubts and questions before they could be expressed, to maintain facades of perfect orthodoxy even in their most private moments. The enforcement of heresy law created a society where intellectual curiosity became dangerous, where asking questions about religious doctrine could be interpreted as evidence of spiritual corruption. Scholars learned to avoid controversial topics. Teachers suppressed discussions that might lead to dangerous conclusions, and students were taught to accept, rather than examine, the foundations of their faith. The impact on medieval intellectual life was devastating. Universities, which had initially been centers of theological inquiry and debate, became institutions focused on rote memorization and uncritical acceptance of established doctrine. The fear of heresy accusations stifled innovation, discouraged original thinking, and created academic environments where conformity was valued more than truth. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of heresy law was how it corrupted personal relationships and community bonds. The knowledge that anyone could be an informant, that casual conversations could be reported to inquisitors, that even family members might betray each other to demonstrate their orthodoxy, poisoned the social fabric of medieval Europe. Families were torn apart by accusations and counter-accusations. Parents informed on children who had expressed unusual ideas. Spouses betrayed each other to save themselves from suspicion. Friends became enemies overnight when religious orthodoxy demanded choosing loyalty to church over loyalty to individuals. The trials that resulted from these accusations often revealed more about community dynamics and personal grudges than about actual heretical beliefs. Business rivals used heresy accusations to eliminate competitors. Neighbors settled property disputes through strategic reports to inquisitors. Political enemies destroyed each other by questioning their opponents' religious orthodoxy. The vague definitions and subjective enforcement of heresy law made them perfect tools for eliminating inconvenient people, regardless of their actual religious beliefs. The same ideas that might be praised as profound theological insight when expressed by a powerful church official, could be condemned as dangerous heresy when spoken by someone with less political protection. This selective enforcement revealed that heresy law was as much about maintaining social and political control as about protecting religious orthodoxy. The death sentences imposed on heretics weren't just punishment for doctrinal deviation. They were tools for eliminating challenges to existing power structures and maintaining the dominance of established elites. The men and women who died as heretics weren't necessarily more irreligious or theologically confused than their contemporaries. They were often people who had the misfortune to express honest doubts, ask uncomfortable questions, or challenge aspects of church doctrine that seemed contradictory or unreasonable. Their executions served to maintain systems of religious authority that benefited some members of society while oppressing others. The spiritual purity that heresy law claimed to protect was often a fiction that masked more practical concerns about institutional power, economic control, and political dominance. Understanding medieval heresy law helps us recognize how the regulation of religious belief continues to serve political purposes in contemporary societies. The same tensions between orthodoxy and dissent, between institutional authority and individual conscience, between collective conformity and personal authenticity that characterized medieval religious persecution continue to influence modern debates about freedom of belief, religious tolerance, and the proper relationship between faith and state power. The heretics who died in medieval Europe weren't just victims of harsh religious laws. They were early martyrs for principles that would eventually transform the world. The idea that individuals should be free to examine religious claims for themselves, that truth emerges through open inquiry rather than authoritarian decree, that personal conscience deserves protection even when it conflicts with official doctrine. Their deaths weren't meaningless tragedies. They were the price paid for religious freedoms that we now consider fundamental human rights, reminders of what we lose when we allow fear of dissent to override respect for intellectual honesty and personal integrity. But our exploration of medieval legal systems isn't complete. We've examined how death sentences were used to control speech, maintain social hierarchies, regulate economic activity, and enforce religious orthodoxy. Now, we must confront the most bizarre and alien aspects of medieval law: the legal treatment of animals, the prosecution of inanimate objects, and the extension of criminal law into realms that seem to belong more to fantasy than to serious jurisprudence. Picture the courtroom in the French city of Falaise on a September morning in 1386. The defendant stands accused of murder, but this is no ordinary criminal trial. The accused is a sow, a female pig who has allegedly killed and partially devoured a human infant. The trial is being conducted with all the solemnity and legal precision normally reserved for cases involving human defendants. The pig has been provided with legal representation, a court-appointed attorney who will argue for her innocence or, failing that, request mercy based on mitigating circumstances. Witnesses will testify about the events leading to the child's death. Evidence will be presented and evaluated, legal precedents will be cited, the full